Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The shift was winding down the way it always did. Machines slowing their rhythm, the light from the tall windows beginning to slant gold across the workroom floor, voices rising just slightly as women straightened their backs and thought about the walk home. It was Saturday, March 25th, 1911, and the 8th and 9th floors of the Ash building hummed with the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of a long week. Girls threaded needles through their last seams. Supervisors counted finished shirtwaists, and someone near the back wall laughed at something her friend had whispered. The air smelled like fabric dust and machine oil, and the faint sweetness of pomade from hair pinned up tight to keep it away from the equipment. In another 20 minutes, the bells would ring, and 300 people would flood down the narrow stairs into Washington Place, into the spring evening, into their separate lives. Sarah Bernstein was thinking about her mother's brisket. She was 16, had been working at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory for 8 months, and could thread a machine faster than most of the girls who'd been there years. Her fingers moved automatically now, feeding fabric through, watching the needle punch its steady line. She didn't need to think about it anymore. That freed her mind to wander to other things, the letter she'd write to her cousin in Brooklyn, the pair of shoes she'd seen in a shop window on her way to work that morning, whether her little brother had remembered to pick up bread like he'd promised. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:30. Half an hour left. Her back ached in the specific way it always did by Saturday afternoon, a dull throb between her shoulder blades that she'd learned to ignore. Beside her, Rose Glantz was already cleaning her station, brushing scraps of fabric into a bin beneath her table. Rose was efficient about everything, the kind of person who finished her quota early and used the extra minutes to tidy, to prepare for Monday, to make sure nothing was out of place. She caught Sarah's eye and smiled. "Almost done," she said in Yiddish, and Sarah nodded, finishing her seam with a flourish and snipping the thread. The room was a forest of identical stations, long tables, black sewing machines, wicker baskets full of cut fabric waiting to be assembled, finished shirtwaists hanging on racks along the walls. The windows were tall but grimy, letting in light but not much of a view. The ceiling was pressed tin, ornate in a way that seemed out of place above the industrial clatter. The floor was wooden, worn smooth in paths where people walked most often, scattered with threads and fabric scraps that would be swept up at the end of the day. It was crowded, deliberately so. Space cost money. Bodies packed close meant more production, more efficiency, more profit. Most of the workers were young women, some as young as 14, many of them immigrants who'd arrived in New York within the last few years. Italian and Yiddish and broken English mixed in the conversations that floated over the machine noise. They came from different countries but shared the same reasons for being here. Family to support, rent to pay, futures to build one paycheck at a time. The work was hard and the hours were long, 52 hours a week, sometimes more. But it was work, and work meant survival. The supervisors paced between the rows, watching, occasionally stopping to check a seam or hurry someone along. They weren't cruel exactly, but they weren't soft either. There was a quota to meet, and sentimentality didn't fill orders. If you needed to use the toilet, you asked permission. If you wanted to get a drink of water, you did it quickly. If you talked too much or worked too slowly, you'd hear about it. The factory operated on a principle of maximum output with minimum waste, and that included wasted time. Near the windows on the 9th floor, someone opened a pane to let in air. The room was warm, it always was, bodies and machines generating heat that had nowhere to go, and the breeze felt good. A few women looked up, grateful for the freshness, then returned to their work. Finishing was the goal now. Getting to the end of the day. Getting to the paycheck on Monday. Getting home. But something was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not yet. Just a smell that didn't belong. A faint sharpness underneath the usual factory odours. Hot in a way that wasn't body heat or machine warmth. Someone on the 8th floor wrinkled her nose and looked around, trying to place it. Someone else kept working, assuming it was nothing, assuming someone had burned something in the cutting room, or a machine was overheating the way they sometimes did. The fire started small, the way most disasters do. Unnoticed, unremarkable. One spark in a bin of fabric scraps beneath a cutting table on the 8th floor. Maybe a cigarette, though smoking wasn't officially allowed. Maybe a match, maybe something. Electrical. The exact cause would be debated later, investigated, argued over in courtrooms and newspapers. But in that moment, the cause didn't matter. What mattered was that fabric burns beautifully. Cotton and linen and silk, thin and dry and piled loose, catching like kindling, the fire finding oxygen and fuel in equal measure. The first person to see actual flames was a cutter named Samuel Bernstein. No relation to Sarah, though they'd joked about it once. He was gathering his tools at his table when he glanced down and saw orange light flickering in the bin beside his feet. For a second, his brain didn't process it. It looked wrong, out of place, like something from a dream. Then instinct kicked in. "Fire!" he shouted, grabbing a bucket of water that sat near the door. Fire buckets were scattered around the floor, a gesture towards safety that everyone assumed they'd never actually need, and throwing it on the flames. The water hit the fabric and the fire recoiled, hissed, seemed to shrink. For a heartbeat, Samuel thought he'd stopped it. Then the flames licked sideways, found new scraps, spread along the floor where fabric dust had settled in invisible layers, and suddenly the fire wasn't small anymore. It was growing, fast. Other workers noticed now. Heads turned, voices rose, someone screamed. The fire moved like it had intent, rushing along the floor, climbing up the side of the cutting table, reaching for the hanging patterns overhead. Samuel grabbed another bucket, threw more water, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with his hands. The fire laughed at him. It found a basket of finished shirtwaists and turned them into torches. It found the wooden table and started gnawing at the edges. "Get out!" someone yelled. "Everyone out!" But out was complicated. The 8th floor erupted into motion. Women standing, grabbing coats, looking for exits, looking for friends, trying to understand how serious this was. The machine stopped. The orderly end-of-shift routine shattered into chaos. Some women moved immediately toward the doors, trusting their instincts. Others hesitated, unsure, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. The supervisors were shouting, but their voices got lost in the noise, in the sudden tide of panic that swept through the room like a wind. The fire fed on hesitation. Every second of confusion gave it more time, more material, more space. It climbed the walls, reaching for the fabric hanging on racks. It spread across the floor in multiple directions at once, moving faster than seemed possible, finding every scrap and thread and feeding itself into something bigger, hotter, angrier. On the 9th floor, directly above, they didn't know yet. Sarah Bernstein was tucking her shears into her bag when she heard the first scream from below. Distant, muffled by the floor between them, but unmistakable. She froze. Rose looked at her, confused. What was that? They would find out soon enough. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of the Ashe building, a 10-story structure on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. It was modern, built just 7 years earlier, considered fireproof because its structure was steel and stone rather than wood. The word fireproof was comforting. It appeared in advertisements, in descriptions, in the casual confidence of people who worked there. What fireproof actually meant was that the building itself wouldn't burn down. It said nothing about what would happen to everything inside it. The factory was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, Businessmen who'd built a successful operation, making shirtwaists, the fashionable blouses worn by working women and office girls all over the city. Business was good. Orders were steady. The Triangle employed around 500 people, mostly young women, mostly immigrants, and ran them hard to meet demand. Blanc and Harris understood profit margins and production efficiency. They knew how to cut costs, maximize output, and keep their workers moving. What they didn't know, or didn't care to know, was that their factory was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The exits were insufficient. There were 4 ways out of the 8th and 9th floors, 2 staircases, 1 fire escape, and 1 elevator. The Washington Place staircase was the main route most workers used. The Green Street staircase existed, but one of its doors was often locked, management's way of controlling when workers could leave, preventing theft, keeping people at their stations until the official end of the shift. The fire escape was a narrow, rickety afterthought bolted to the outside of the building, designed for a much smaller building and dubiously maintained. The elevator could hold maybe 15 people at a time and required an operator. 4 exits for 500 people. Do the math. The fire hoses on each floor were rotted, their valves rusted, shut from disuse. The fire buckets held water, but not nearly enough. There were no sprinklers, no alarm system, no clear evacuation plan, no regular fire drills. The doors opened inward, which meant that in a crush of panicking people, they'd become impassable barriers. The aisles between work tables were narrow, designed to maximize workspace rather than facilitate movement. Safety regulations existed in 1911, but enforcement was lax and loopholes were plentiful. Factory owners hired lawyers who knew how to navigate inspections, who understood which rules could be bent and which inspectors could be convinced to look the other way. The Ash building had passed its inspections. On paper, it was compliant. In reality, it was a trap wrapped in bureaucratic approval. The workers knew the building wasn't safe. They'd complained before. 2 years earlier, in 1909, 20,000 shirtwaist workers across New York had gone on strike. The uprising of 20,000, they called it, demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The Triangle workers had been part of that strike. They'd walked picket lines through the winter, faced down police and hired thugs, held strong for months. Some improvements had come from it, small victories in pay and hours, but the fundamental safety issues remained unresolved. The doors stayed locked. The fire escape stayed inadequate. The aisles stayed narrow. The women went back to work because they needed the money. They swallowed their fear and trusted that nothing would happen. Most days, nothing did. Most days, you clocked in, sewed shirtwaists, clocked out, went home. Most days, the locked doors and overcrowded floors and useless fire equipment didn't matter because there was no fire. March 25th wasn't most days. On the 8th floor, the fire was winning. It had grown from a bin-sized problem to a room-sized catastrophe in less than 3 minutes. The cutting room was fully engulfed now, flames reaching the ceiling, smoke pouring out in thick black clouds. Workers were running for the doors, shoving, screaming, trying to reach the staircases before the fire cut them off. The Washington Place stairwell filled with people immediately, a flood of bodies pressing down the narrow steps, women stumbling, catching themselves on the railings, moving as fast as fear could push them. The stairwell was dim, lit only by small windows at each landing, and the smoke was already chasing them down, filling the space with choking darkness. They couldn't see where they were going. They moved by feel, by instinct, by following the person in front of them, and praying that person knew the way. Some women tried the Green Street staircase and found the door locked. They pounded on it, screaming, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door opened inward, and the crush of bodies pressing against it from their side made it impossible to operate, even if someone had miraculously unlocked it from the other side. They abandoned. It turned back, fought their way toward the Washington Place side, through smoke and heat and rising panic. Others rushed to the elevator. The operator, Joseph Zito, had made one trip already, cramming as many women as the car would hold and dropping them to the ground floor. He came back up, opened the doors, and was nearly overwhelmed by the crowd trying to force their way in. "Wait! Wait!" he shouted, but waiting felt like dying. Women pushed, climbed over each other, desperate for any chance of escape. Zito got the elevator full, past full really, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, and dropped again. He'd make the trip multiple times, cramming in as many as physics would allow. But there were limits. The elevator could only move so fast, it could only hold so many, and the fire wasn't waiting. The fire escape seemed like salvation. It was on the Washington Place side, accessible through a window. Women climbed out onto it, felt the iron grating under their feet, started making their way down. The escape was only 18 inches wide, barely room for one person, but they squeezed past each other, holding onto the railings, trying not to look down. The structure swayed under their weight. It hadn't been designed for this kind of load. This many people at once, this much panic and motion. Someone near the top noticed that the ladder, the final section that would take them from the second floor landing down to the ground, was missing. Just gone. Maybe it had never been installed. Maybe it had rusted away. Either way, there was a 12-foot gap between the bottom of the fire escape and the pavement below. They'd figure that out when they got there. Right now, the priority was getting down as far as the fire escape would take them. Anything was better than staying inside with the flames. On the 9th floor, Sarah Bernstein finally understood that something was terribly wrong. The smell had gotten stronger, acrid, chemical, wrong in every way. Then someone burst through from the stairwell, face streaked with soot, screaming, "Fire! The building's on fire! Get out!" The 9th floor dissolved into the same chaos that had consumed the 8th moments earlier. Women grabbed their belongings, their friends, anything they thought they'd need. Some ran immediately for the doors. Others froze, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from routine to crisis. The machines sat abandoned, silent, threads still hanging from needles, work left mid-seam. Sarah grabbed Rose's arm. "We have to go. Now." They joined the stream of bodies flowing toward the Washington Place stairwell. The hallway was already thick with smoke filtering up from below. Sarah's eyes burned. She pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, trying to filter the air, but it didn't help much. The smoke was everywhere, invisible poison, filling her lungs with each breath. She started coughing, couldn't stop, felt her chest tightening. The stairwell was packed, women pressed together so tightly that moving became almost impossible. Sarah felt herself carried along by the crowd, her feet barely touching the steps, just flowing downward with the mass of bodies. Someone stumbled in front of her, and Sarah nearly went down, caught herself on the railing, kept moving. The heat was rising up from below, turning the stairwell into an oven. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with tears from the smoke. She couldn't see Rose anymore. She'd lost her somewhere in the crush. She tried calling out, but her voice disappeared into the collective, screaming, crying, coughing that filled the narrow space. The stairs seemed endless. How many floors? Sarah had climbed them every day for 8 months, but now she couldn't remember. Were they on the 7th floor yet? The 6th. The smoke made everything the same. Dark, hot, suffocating. She just kept moving down, trusting that down meant out, that eventually this nightmare stairwell would spit them into the street and safety and air they could breathe. Some women on the 9th floor tried to reach the roof. It made a kind of sense. Fire burns upward, so going up might buy time, might get them away from the worst of it. They rushed up the narrow stairs to the 10th floor, where the executive offices were, and found the door to the roof. It was locked. They pounded on it, screamed for help. On the other side of that door was the roof, was open air, was a chance of being rescued by firefighters with ladders, or jumping to adjacent buildings, or at least dying of smoke in the sky, rather than burning in a stairwell. The door stayed locked. Someone on the 10th floor, factory bookkeeper's office, management territory, a different world from the factory floors below, heard the pounding and opened the door. Women poured through. scrambling up the final stairs, emerging onto the roof, into daylight and air that didn't burn their lungs. They were safe, for now. Trapped, but safe. The roof of the building next door was only a few feet away, separated by a small gap. Men from that building, workers who'd seen the smoke and come to help, reached across and pulled women over, one by one. It was slow, terrifying work. The gap looked small but felt enormous when you were the one stepping across it with nothing but 10 stories of air below you. But it worked. Women made it across. Not all of them. Not most of them. But some. On the 8th floor, the fire had become absolute. The entire workspace was burning now. Tables, fabric, walls, ceiling. The heat was unbearable. The smoke impenetrable. Anyone still on that floor was out of time and out of options. The few women who hadn't made it to a stairwell or the elevator or the fire escape found themselves trapped in a maze of flame and smoke, surrounded by their burning workplace. Unable to see, unable to breathe, unable to find a way out. They went to the windows. Outside, on Washington Place and Green Street, the world was just beginning to understand what was happening. It was nearly 5 o'clock on a pleasant Saturday afternoon. People were walking home from work, running errands, enjoying the spring weather. Then someone looked up and saw smoke pouring from the upper floors of the Ash building. Then someone else saw flames visible through the windows. Then someone saw movement in those windows. People, women, silhouetted against the fire. The first person to fall jumped from the 9th floor. She appeared in a window, hesitated for a moment that stretched into eternity, then stepped out into nothing. The crowd below gasped, screamed, watched her drop. She hit the pavement with a sound that people would remember for the rest of their lives. A terrible, final sound that no human being should make. Then another person jumped. Then 2 people jumped together, holding hands. Then more, a steady stream of bodies falling from windows on the 8th and 9th floors. Choosing a quick death in the air over a slow death in the fire. The crowd on the street grew rapidly, passers-by stopping, shopkeepers rushing out, people from neighbouring buildings coming to see what the commotion was about. They stood in horrified clusters, looking up, unable to look away, unable to process what they were witnessing. This was New York City, modern and civilized and safe. Things like this didn't happen here. Couldn't happen here, but it was happening, right in front of them, bodies falling from the sky in broad daylight. Someone called the fire department. Actually, many people called the fire department. The alarm came in at 4:45 p.m. and fire companies responded immediately. Engine companies, ladder companies, the fire chief himself. They raced toward Washington Place with bells clanging and horses galloping, ready to fight a fire, ready to rescue people, ready to do their jobs. They arrived to find hell waiting for them. The first thing the firefighters saw when they reached the Ash building was the bodies on the pavement, women who'd jumped, their bodies broken, blood spreading in dark pools on the cobblestones. The firefighters had seen death before. It came with the job, but not like this. Not this many, not this young, not still falling as they watched. The second thing they saw was that their ladders were useless. The tallest ladder in the New York City Fire Department could reach the 6th floor. The fire was on the 8th and 9th. They could get their ladders up, but they couldn't get them high enough to do any good. They tried anyway, extending them as far as they'd go, hoping maybe someone could climb down far enough to reach. But the math didn't work. The gap was too great. The third thing they saw was that their safety nets wouldn't hold. The department had life nets, large circular nets held by firefighters that people could jump into from burning buildings. They'd work for a few stories, would catch someone falling from a 2nd or 3rd floor window, but from 8 stories up, from 9 stories up, bodies fell with too much force, too much speed. The nets couldn't absorb that kind of impact. The firefighters held them out anyway, desperately, but the women crashed through them like they weren't there, hitting the pavement underneath. Water from the fire hoses became the priority. If they couldn't rescue people directly, They could fight the fire, keep it from spreading, maybe save whoever was still inside. The firefighters connected their hoses to hydrants, aimed their streams at the windows, poured water onto the flames. The water was effective against the fire itself. This was a real fire department with real equipment and training, but it couldn't turn back time. It couldn't save the people who'd already burned or jumped or suffocated in the smoke. Sarah Bernstein made it out of the stairwell. She stumbled through the ground floor exit onto Washington Place, into the evening air, into a scene that looked like a nightmare painted onto reality. Smoke, screaming, firefighters running, bodies on the ground covered with coats and blankets. She bent over, coughing, trying to clear her lungs, trying to understand where she was and what had just happened. A firefighter grabbed her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still coughing. "Move back, get away from the building." She moved, dazed, joining a crowd of other survivors who stood in shocked clusters on the far side of the street. Some were crying, some were silent, some were frantically looking for friends, calling out names, trying to account for everyone they knew. Sarah looked for Rose but didn't see her. She looked at the building, at the windows, where flames still licked out, at the smoke pouring into the darkening sky, and felt her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. This was her workplace. She'd been in there 10 minutes ago. She'd been sewing a shirtwaist, thinking about brisket, planning her evening. Now it was burning and people were jumping from windows, and she was standing on the street in her work dress, without her coat, because she'd left it hanging on her chair when she ran. More women emerged from the building, stumbling, coughing, supported by firefighters or other survivors. The elevator operator, Joseph Zaito, had kept making trips up and down until the elevator stopped working, had saved dozens of people through sheer stubborn courage. Women from the 9th floor who'd made it to the roof and crossed to the adjacent building were climbing down through that building's stairs, emerging blocks away, slowly finding their way back to the scene. But so many didn't emerge. So many were still inside, or had jumped, or were unaccounted for. The fire escape had failed. The structure, overloaded with far more weight than it was designed to carry, had pulled away from the building. The iron bolts anchoring it to the wall had torn free under the strain, and the entire apparatus had collapsed, sending everyone on it tumbling down 8 stories. They'd fallen in a tangle of iron and bodies crashing into the courtyard below. Some had survived the fall somehow, pulled themselves out of the wreckage with broken bones and burns. Most hadn't. The firefighters fought the fire for hours as darkness fell, and electric lights came on throughout the city. The flames consumed everything combustible on the 8th and 9th floors, then gradually ran out of fuel. The building stood. It was fireproof after all, or at least the structure was, but the interior was destroyed. By the time the fire was fully extinguished and the smoke had cleared enough for firefighters to enter safely, it was late evening. What they found inside made hardened firefighters weep. Bodies everywhere, piled against locked doors where women had been trapped, trying to escape, huddled under tables where some had sought shelter from the flames, scattered across the floor where they'd collapsed from smoke inhalation, burned beyond recognition in many cases, reduced to shapes that were barely human. The stairwells held bodies of women who'd been trampled in the rush to escape, who'd fallen and been unable to get up before the crowd swept over them. The elevator shaft held bodies of women who'd tried to climb down the cables when the elevator stopped running, who'd lost their grip and fallen 8 floors to the basement. The space where the fire escape had been held, pieces of the iron structure, and the bodies of everyone who'd been on it when it fell. The firefighters moved carefully through the wreckage, documenting, recovering, trying to maintain professionalism in the face of overwhelming tragedy. They found tools melted into unrecognizable shapes. They found sewing machines that had survived the fire better than the people who'd operated them. They found charred fabric and twisted metal, and the small personal items that workers had carried. Hairpins, coins, a lunch pail, a locket. On the street outside, the crowd had swelled to thousands. News of the fire had spread through the neighbourhood. Through the city, people came to witness, to help, to search for loved ones who worked at the Triangle and hadn't come home. Police set up barricades to keep the crowd back, to preserve the scene, to maintain some kind of order in the chaos. Journalists arrived with notebooks and cameras, documenting everything. This was news, big news, the kind of disaster that would dominate headlines for days. They interviewed survivors, firefighters, witnesses. They took photographs of the building, the bodies, the crowd. Some of them did it with appropriate solemnity. Others were more interested in getting the most dramatic shot, the most compelling quote, the story that would sell papers. A young woman named Frances Perkins stood in the crowd, watching the building burn. She was a labour activist and social worker, educated and passionate about workers' rights and safety reform. She'd been having tea with friends nearby when they heard the fire engines and came to see. She watched women jump from the windows. She watched the firefighters' ladders stop short. She watched the nets fail. She stood there and witnessed the entire catastrophe, and it burned itself into her memory in a way that would shape the rest of her life. Decades later, as the US Secretary of Labor under President Franklin Roosevelt, Frances Perkins would help create the New Deal, including many of the labor protections and safety standards that Americans would come to take for granted. She would point back to this day, to standing on a New York street, watching women burn and jump and die, as the moment that defined her life's work. The Triangle fire didn't just kill those women, it created a witness whose horror transformed into policy, into laws, into changes that would protect millions of workers who came after. But that was later. On March 25, 1911, Frances Perkins was just one person in a crowd of thousands, watching helplessly as the fire did its work. The recovery effort continued through the night. Firefighters and police officers carried bodies out of the building, lining them up on the sidewalk with whatever dignity they could manage. The bodies were transported to a temporary morgue set up at a pier on the East River, Pier 26, hastily converted into a space large enough to handle mass casualties. By Sunday morning, the count was becoming clear. 146 dead, most of them women, most of them young, some as young as 14, most of them immigrants with names that reflected the old countries they'd left behind. Italian names, Jewish names, names that would appear in newspapers spelled 3 different ways because the journalists didn't know how to transliterate them correctly. The list of the dead was published and people searched it desperately, looking for their daughters, their sisters, their friends. Some families found confirmation of what they'd feared. Others found nothing, no name matching who they were looking for, and faced an agonizing uncertainty. Was their loved one among the burned bodies that couldn't be identified? Had they somehow escaped and just not made it home yet? Had there been a mistake? The city set up a system for identification at the morgue. Families could come to view the bodies, could try to recognize their loved ones by clothing, by jewellery, by any identifying feature that had survived the fire. It was grim, traumatic work. Some bodies were identifiable. Others were burned so badly that recognition was impossible. Some families would wait days, weeks, hoping for information that would never come. The funerals began almost immediately. Individual services for those whose families could afford them and whose bodies could be identified. Mass funerals for others. On April 5th, a week after the fire, a massive memorial procession marched through the streets of Manhattan. Estimates put the number of marchers at over 100,000, with another 250,000 lining the streets to watch. It was cold and rainy, but people came anyway. Workers, union members, reformers, immigrants, people who'd lost loved ones, and people who'd simply been horrified by what had happened. They marched in silence, a river of grief flowing through the city, carrying signs demanding justice, demanding reform, demanding that this never happen again. Empty hearses represented the unidentified victims, the women whose bodies had been too badly burned for anyone to claim. The procession passed the Ash building, still standing, its upper floors visibly damaged, windows broken, walls blackened with soot. The city's grief turned quickly to anger. How had this happened? Who was responsible? What would be done to prevent it from happening again? The factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were indicted on manslaughter charges. The theory was simple. They'd kept the doors locked, trapping workers inside, and that decision had directly caused deaths. The trial became a public spectacle, a referendum not just on two men, but on the entire system of industrial labour in America. The prosecution argued that Blank and Harris had prioritised profit over safety, that they'd known the conditions were dangerous and had done nothing, that they'd literally locked women inside a building that became a death trap. They brought in survivors to testify about the locked doors, the inadequate exits, the fear they'd felt even before the fire about what would happen if something went wrong. The defence argued that the locked doors were a common practice, that Blank and Harris were following industry standards, that they couldn't have foreseen such a catastrophic fire. They argued that the real culprit was the fire itself, an unpredictable accident, not the decisions of the factory owners. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict, not guilty. The evidence of the locked doors wasn't conclusive enough. Too many witnesses contradicted each other. Too much reasonable doubt existed about who had locked which door and when and whether that specific door would have made a difference to the specific victims. Blank and Harris walked free. They'd lost their factory, but not their liberty, not their business. They even collected a sizable insurance payout from the fire, more than they paid out in the civil suits that followed, where some victims' families sued for damages. The insurance company paid them $60,000 more than they paid to the families, a profit margin written in the bodies of their workers. The verdict enraged people who'd followed the trial, who'd expected justice, who'd believed that such an obvious tragedy would lead to obvious consequences. Blank and Harris became symbols of a system that valued profit over people, that could let 146 workers die and shrug it off as the cost of doing business. But while the criminal justice system failed to punish the guilty, the political system began, slowly, to respond. The New York State Legislature created the Factory Investigating Commission in the wake of the fire, tasked with examining working conditions throughout the state and recommending reforms. The commission was led by Al Smith and Robert Wagner, both young Democratic politicians who would go on to significant careers, shaped in part by what they learned during these investigations. The commission didn't just study the Triangle fire, they investigated factories across New York, documenting conditions, interviewing workers, seeing firsthand the dangers that existed in workplace after workplace. They found locked doors, inadequate fire escapes, blocked exits, missing safety equipment, overcrowded workspaces, the same problems that had killed 146 people at the Triangle, repeated in factory after factory throughout the state. Over the next few years, New York passed a series of labour laws addressing fire safety, building codes, working hours, and workplace conditions. Doors had to open outward, fire escapes had to be sturdy and actually reach the ground. Buildings had to have sprinkler systems. There had to be enough exits for the number of workers. Fire drills had to be conducted regularly. Working hours for women and children were limited. It wasn't enough. It didn't bring anyone back. It didn't punish the owners who'd prioritised profit over safety. But it was something. It was 146 deaths transformed into rules and regulations, into inspections and enforcement, into a recognition that workers' lives had value and that protecting those lives was a legitimate function of government. The reforms spread beyond New York. Other states looked at what had happened at the Triangle and examined their own laws, their own factories, their own vulnerabilities. The federal government began, slowly, to develop workplace safety standards. Labour unions used the fire as a rallying cry, a proof of why workers needed collective bargaining power, why they needed to organise and demand safety along with fair wages. The fire became a story, a parable, a warning. It was taught in schools, referenced in political speeches, remembered in ceremonies and memorials. It became the answer to the question, why do we have fire codes? The reason buildings have exit signs, the reason doors in public spaces open outward, the reason inspectors check for sprinkler systems and fire escapes. It all traced back in part to March 25th, 1911, and 146 people who went to work on a Saturday morning and never came home. Sarah Bernstein survived. She testified at the trial, describing the locked doors and the panic and the smoke. She never went back to factory work. The thought of being in a crowded workspace again, of hearing machines running, of being on an upper floor, it made her physically ill. She found different work, quieter work, slower work that paid less but didn't trigger the memories that lurked in every sound and smell. Rose Glantz didn't survive. Sarah learned this 2 days after the fire, when Rose's name appeared on the list of the dead. They'd been separated in the stairwell, and Rose had never made it out. Sarah went to the funeral, stood with Rose's family, and felt the guilt of survival, the irrational but overwhelming sense that she should have done something, should have held on tighter, should have saved her friend. The Ash building still stands. It's known now as the Brown Building, part of New York University. Students walk through its halls, attend classes, use the spaces where women once sewed shirtwaist. There are plaques commemorating the fire, explaining what happened here, listing the names of the dead. The building itself is a memorial, a reminder, a piece of history that refuses to disappear. Every year, on March 25th, there's a ceremony. People gather outside the building to remember, to read the names, to place flowers, and stand in silence. Union members come, labour historians, descendants of the victims, anyone who believes that remembering matters. They read 146 names aloud, slowly, giving each one weight and time. They talk about the fire, about the reforms that followed, about the ongoing work of protecting workers' rights and safety. The names echo in the air above Washington Place. Adler, Lizzie, age 24. Altman, Anna, age 16. Ardito, Anina, age 25. Each name a person, a life. A set of dreams that ended in smoke and fire. Bassino, Rose, age 31. Benanti, Vincenza, age 22. Berger, Jetta, age 18. Some were so young. Children really, working to support their families, doing adult labour with adult consequences. Bernstein, Essie, age 19. No relation to Sarah, but Sarah always paused when that name was read, thinking about another girl with her name who hadn't made it. Bernstein, Morris, age 19. One of the few men on the list. Most of the victims were women because most of the workers were women. Bilota, Vincenza, age 16. The reading continues. Every name matters. Every name deserves to be spoken, to be remembered, to be more than a number in a tragedy. Brenman Rosie, age 23. Brenman Sarah, age 17. Brodsky, Ida, age 17. The ages are what hurt. So many teenagers. So many people who should have had decades of life ahead of them. The fire changed how America thought about work, about safety, about the relationship between employers and employees. Before Triangle, workplace safety was largely seen as the worker's responsibility. If you didn't like the conditions, you could quit. You could find another job. You were free to make your own choices. After Triangle, the idea took hold that maybe freedom wasn't enough, that maybe people working in a building had a right to assume that building wouldn't kill them, that some protections needed to be mandatory rather than optional. It changed how people thought about regulation. The word regulation sounds bureaucratic, boring, unnecessary, red tape that slows down business and costs money. But regulations are written in blood. Every rule about fire exits, every requirement for sprinkler systems, every standard for building materials and emergency lighting and occupancy limits. They exist because of disasters, because people died, because society decided that preventing future deaths was worth the cost of compliance. The Triangle Fire didn't create this understanding overnight. The fight for workplace safety continued for decades after 1911 and continues still. But the fire was a watershed moment, a line between before and after, a proof that couldn't be ignored that the old way of doing things was killing people. The garment industry, where the Triangle had operated, became a focus of labour organising. The International Ladies' Garment Workers' Union grew in strength and influence, using the fire as evidence of why workers needed collective power. They fought for better contracts, safer conditions, fair wages. They won some battles and lost others, but they kept fighting, kept organising, kept pushing for change. The broader labour movement took note as well. The fire demonstrated that women workers faced particular vulnerabilities. They were often young, often immigrants, often dismissed as temporary workers who didn't need protection because they'd get married and leave the workforce anyway. The reality was that women were permanent, essential parts of the industrial economy, and their safety mattered just as much as men's. Frances Perkins never forgot what she witnessed. When she became Secretary of Labour in 1933, the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, she brought the memory of the Triangle Fire with her. She pushed for social security, for unemployment insurance, for the Fair Labour Standards Act that established minimum wage and maximum hours. She saw these policies as connected to that Saturday in 1911 as ways of protecting workers from the kind of exploitation and neglect that had turned a factory into a death trap. In 1961, 50 years after the fire, Perkins gave a speech at a memorial service. She was an old woman by then, her voice wavering but her memory sharp. She described watching the women jump, watching the firefighters' futile efforts, feeling the helplessness of witnessing disaster without being able to stop it. She talked about how the fire had shaped everything she'd done in her career, how the ghosts of those 146 victims had pushed her to fight for protections that might save other workers from similar fates. They did not die in vain, she said. Though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She wanted to believe that their deaths had meaning, that the reforms had been worth it, that things had changed, but she also knew how hard every inch of progress had been, how much resistance there had been to even basic safety requirements, how many other workers had died in the decades since the Triangle, because the lessons still hadn't been fully learned. The fire became a case study in universities, a standard reference in courses on labour history, industrial safety, urban development, and progressive reform. Students examined the Triangle Fire to understand how workplace disasters happen, how regulatory systems develop, how public tragedy can drive political change. They studied the factory owners' decisions, the workers' experiences, the firefighters' limitations, the lawyers' arguments, the politicians' responses. But it's one thing to study a disaster academically, to analyse it from a distance of decades and approach it as historical fact. It's another thing to imagine it as immediate and personal, to put yourself in the position of a teenage girl at a sewing machine when she first smells smoke, to feel the panic of being trapped, to understand the choice between burning and jumping. The horror of the Triangle Fire isn't just in the death toll, though 146 deaths in a single afternoon is staggering. It's in the preventability of it, the unnecessary nature of every death. The building didn't collapse, the structure held. With proper safety measures, unlocked doors, adequate exits, functional fire equipment, reasonable occupancy limits, most or all of those workers could have evacuated safely. The fire would still have been a disaster, would still have destroyed the factory, would still have cost the owners money, but it wouldn't have had to cost 146 lives. That's what makes it unbearable to think about. Not that a fire happened. Fires happen, accidents occur. Tragedies are part of the human experience, but that people knew the conditions were dangerous and did nothing. That women had complained about locked doors and been ignored. That inspections had been passed through a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and willful blindness. That profit margins were valued more than human life. The owners, Blank and Harris, never expressed meaningful remorse. They maintained that they'd done nothing wrong, that the fire was a tragedy but not their fault, that they'd been unfairly scapegoated for, following standard industry practices. After the trial, they reopened their business elsewhere, continued in the garment trade, continued to be successful. A few years later, Blank was fined for locking a door in his new factory during working hours. A small fine, barely an inconvenience, certainly not enough to change his behaviour. He'd learned nothing. Some of the survivors struggled for the rest of their lives with what they'd witnessed and experienced. The trauma didn't end when the fire did. It lived in their nightmares, in their sudden panics when they smelled smoke or heard sirens, in their inability to be in crowded rooms or on upper floors. Some developed what we'd now recognise as PTSD, though in 1911 there was no name for it, no treatment for it, just a expectation that you'd move on and get over it and return to normal. Others channeled their trauma into activism. They joined unions, participated in demonstrations, told their stories to journalists and investigators and politicians. They refused to let people forget, refused to let the fire become just another statistic. They testified at trials, spoke at memorial services, worked to ensure that the deaths of their co-workers and friends resulted in meaningful change. The 7 unidentified victims haunted the city for years. 7 sets of remains that were too badly burned for anyone to claim with certainty. They were buried in a common grave in Brooklyn, marked with a monument that listed them simply as unknown. Families came to that grave to mourn, hoping that maybe their missing daughter or sister was there, having some place to grieve even without certainty. In 2011, 100 years after the fire, a researcher identified some of the previously unknown victims through genealogical work and new analysis of the evidence. The discovery brought closure to descendants who'd grown up knowing that an ancestor had died in the Triangle fire, but not knowing whether she'd been identified or where she'd been buried. It was a reminder that even a century later, the fire's impact rippled through families, through communities, through the city's memory. The centennial commemoration in 2011 was massive. Thousands of people participated in events throughout the city. Memorial services, exhibitions, theatrical performances, historical lectures, walking tours. Schools taught special lessons about the fire. Newspapers ran retrospectives. Union leaders connected the Triangle fire to contemporary labour struggles, arguing that the fight for worker safety and dignity continued in new forms. Artists created works inspired by the fire. Paintings, sculptures, performances, installations. Poets wrote about the victims, about the grief, about the ongoing relevance of the tragedy. Musicians composed memorial pieces. The fire had become not just history, but culture, embedded in the city's identity, part of how New Yorkers understood their city's past and present. But perhaps the most powerful, Memorial was the quietest, the annual reading of the names. Every March 25th, people gathered outside the building and took turns reading 146 names aloud, slowly, clearly, giving each one space to exist in the air. It took hours to read them all. People stood in weather, good and bad, sunshine and rain, warmth and cold, and listened as the names were spoken. The reading served multiple purposes. It honoured the dead individually, treating them as people rather than statistics. It created a communal act of remembrance, bringing together people who cared about labour history and worker safety and social justice. It reminded everyone who participated that these were real people, daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, who had lives and hopes and futures that ended in a preventable disaster. And it served as a warning. Because while workplace safety had improved dramatically since 1911, workers still died in preventable accidents. Factories in developing countries still locked workers. Inside, still operated without adequate safety equipment, still prioritised profit over people. The Triangle Fire wasn't just history, it was a template, a pattern that repeated whenever capitalism was allowed to operate without restraint or oversight. The fire asked a question that remains relevant. How much is a worker's life worth? What protections are we willing to mandate? What costs are we willing to impose on businesses to ensure safety? Where do we draw the line between economic freedom and human life? Different people answer differently. Some argue that too much regulation stifles business, kills jobs, reduces competitiveness. Others argue that no amount of profit justifies risking workers' lives, that safety should never be optional, that the Triangle Fire proved the necessity of strong enforced regulations. The debate continues, playing out in arguments about OSHA regulations, workplace safety standards, building codes, inspection requirements. Every time someone complains about government red tape or unnecessary regulations, the Triangle Fire is the counter-argument, the example of what happens when business operates without sufficient oversight, when profits take priority over safety, when workers are treated as disposable. The women who died in the Triangle Fire were not heroes. They didn't choose to sacrifice themselves for a cause. They were ordinary workers doing their jobs, trying to earn money, supporting their families, living their lives. They died because the people who owned their workplace made decisions that prioritized efficiency and profit over their safety and survival. That's what makes their deaths so tragic and so meaningful. They weren't soldiers dying in battle or martyrs dying for a cause. They were seamstresses, teenagers, immigrants, working girls, the kind of people who usually don't make headlines, whose lives are considered ordinary and unremarkable. But their deaths forced society to see them, to acknowledge that their lives had value, to recognise that working people deserved protection. The fire created martyrs accidentally. It turned ordinary workers into symbols of a movement they hadn't chosen to lead. Their names became rallying cries for labour reform. Their deaths became evidence in political arguments. Their suffering became the foundation for laws and regulations that would protect millions of workers who came after. Sarah Bernstein lived to be 93 years old. She married, had children, built a life far from the garment industry and the horrors of that March afternoon. But she never forgot. She attended memorial services when she could, told her story to anyone who would listen, and kept a list of the victims' names tucked in her Bible. Near the end of her life, when her grandchildren asked her about the fire, she cried, nearly 80 years after the event, and she still cried when she talked about it. I think about Rose sometimes, she told them. I think about how we were friends, how we worked side by side, how we talked about our futures. And then there was no future for her, just smoke and fire and terror. I got out and she didn't. I've never understood why. Why me and not her? What made my life worth saving and hers worth losing? There was no answer to that question. Survival was random, determined by which door you chose, which stairwell you reached, which second you made your decision. Some lived and some died, and the difference was chance as much as anything. The Ash building stands as a monument to the fact that buildings endure but people don't, that structures can be fireproof even when the lives inside them aren't, that safety is a choice society makes, and that sometimes we make that choice too late to save the people who needed us to make it sooner. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 workers in 18 minutes. That's one death every 7.5 seconds. In the time it takes to read a page, multiple people died. In the time it takes to walk down a few flights of stairs, dozens of people died. The speed of it, the sudden transformation from routine to catastrophe, is part of what makes it so haunting. But the fire also killed slowly, in the decades of trauma that survivors carried, in the grief that families endured, in the reforms that took years to implement and decades to enforce. The fire was a moment in time, but its consequences rippled outward indefinitely, affecting laws and culture and politics and how people thought about work and safety and the value of human life. Every time you walk through a door marked exit, every time you notice a sprinkler head on a ceiling, every time you see a fire extinguisher mounted on a wall or an illuminated sign pointing toward the stairs, those are memorials to the Triangle Fire. Those are the quiet monuments that protect you every day, the invisible safeguards built into the infrastructure of modern life. The fire taught that safety isn't natural or automatic. It has to be designed, built, maintained, enforced. It requires laws and regulations and inspections and penalties for violations. It requires taking worker safety seriously, treating it as essential rather than optional, building it into the structure of how business operates. It taught that prevention is worth the cost. Fire escapes are expensive. Sprinkler systems are expensive. Adequate exits reduce usable workspace. Safety equipment and training take time and money. But all of that is cheaper, in every sense that matters, than coffins for 146 workers. And it taught that workers' lives have value, that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs deserve extraordinary protection, that a teenage immigrant girl at a sewing machine is just as human and just as worthy of safety as anyone else in society. The fire was a horror, a tragedy, an entirely preventable disaster that killed 146 people who should have lived. But it was also a catalyst, a turning point, a moment when society looked at the costs of industrialization and decided that maybe, just maybe, we could do better. We remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, not to dwell on tragedy, but to honour the dead and protect the living. We remember it because forgetting would be a betrayal, would allow the same patterns to repeat, would let their deaths become meaningless. We remember it because memory is protective, because the stories we tell about the past shape the choices we make in the present. 146 names, 146 lives, 146 reasons why safety matters, why regulations exist, why worker protection is a moral imperative and not just an economic calculation. They went to work on a Saturday morning in March and they never came home. That simple fact, that ordinary tragedy, changed America. It didn't change everything, didn't solve every problem, didn't create perfect safety or perfect justice, but it changed something important, something fundamental about how we think about work and workers and the responsibilities we have to protect people from preventable harm. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire remains relevant because the questions it raises remain unanswered. How do we balance profit and safety? How do we protect vulnerable workers? How do we enforce standards without stifling business? How do we prevent the next Triangle fire before it happens rather than learning from it afterward? The ghosts of those 146 workers haunt us still, asking if we've learned enough, if we've changed enough, if their deaths brought enough protection for the workers who came after. The answer is mixed. We've learned some lessons and forgotten others. We've made progress and backslid. We've created protections and then weakened them in the name of economic efficiency. But we remember, every March 25th, we read the names, we stand outside that building, and we remember that this happened, that it was preventable, that it changed things. We remember because memory is what stands between us and repetition, between progress and regression, between honouring the dead and betraying them. The fire is over. It ended in 1911, burned out, was extinguished, became history, but its heat still warms the forge where worker protections are hammered out. Its smoke still rises as a warning. Its victims still speak, through the laws and regulations and cultural changes that followed, still insisting that work should not cost your life, that safety is a right, that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs deserve to go home at the end of the day. That's the memorial that matters most, not the plaques or the ceremonies or the annual readings, important as those are. The real memorial is built into the infrastructure of modern life, into the codes and standards and regulations that make workplaces safer, that protect workers from the kind of neglect that turned the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory into a death trap. 146 people died so that others might live. They didn't choose that sacrifice. They didn't volunteer for martyrdom. They just went to work, and the systems that should have protected them failed. And they died because profit mattered more than safety, until their deaths forced society to recalculate that equation. We owe them memory. We owe them the truth of what happened and why. We owe them the commitment to learn from their deaths, to build the protections they never had, to ensure that the next generation of workers has the safety that was denied to them. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was one disaster, one afternoon, one moment of horror in a single building. But it stands for something larger, for every time workers have been sacrificed to profit, for every preventable disaster that wasn't prevented, for every death that could have been avoided if only someone had cared enough to act. We remember because they can't forget. We honour them by building the world they deserve to live in. We speak their names because silence would be complicity, would allow their deaths to fade into statistics, would let them become just numbers in a history book, rather than people who loved and hoped and dreamed and died too young, too terribly, too unnecessarily. The fire burns still in memory, in the laws it created, in the protections it demanded, in the ongoing fight for worker safety and dignity. As long as we remember, as long as we tell the story, as long as we read the names and honour the dead and fight to protect the living, the Triangle Fire serves its purpose. Not as entertainment or spectacle, but as lesson, as warning, as proof that ordinary people matter and that their safety is worth fighting for. 146 names, 146 lives, one fire, one moment that changed everything, that forced society to see what it had been ignoring, that demanded change and slowly, painfully, incompletely won it. They deserve to be remembered, not for how they died, though that matters, but for who they were, for the lives they should have lived, for the futures they were denied. They were workers, daughters, sisters, friends. They were ordinary people doing necessary work, feeding themselves and their families, building lives in a new country, hoping for better days. They didn't get those better days. But maybe, because of them, others did. Maybe the laws and regulations and reforms that followed their deaths saved others from similar fates. Maybe their tragedy prevented other tragedies. Maybe their deaths, meaningless and preventable as they were, meant something after all. That's what we choose to believe when we remember. That's what we're honouring when we read their names. Not the fire, not the disaster, not the horror, but the people, the lives, the stubborn insistence that their deaths demand something better from the living. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened on March 25th, 1911. It's over. But it's not finished. As long as workers need protection, as long as safety requires vigilance, as long as profit threatens to overwhelm humanity, the fire remains relevant, remains urgent, remains a story that needs telling. So we tell it, we remember it. We honour the dead by protecting the living. And we read the names slowly, clearly, giving each one the weight of a life, the dignity of remembrance, the power of a lesson learned too late but not forgotten. 146 names, 146 reasons to care about safety, to value workers, to build systems that protect people rather than endanger them. 146 voices speaking from the past, asking if we've learned, if we've changed, if their deaths purchased the protections they needed but never had. The answer is imperfect. The work is ongoing. The fight continues. But we remember, and in remembering, we honour them. We keep their story alive. We refuse to let them fade into statistics and obscurity. We insist that they mattered, that their lives had value, that their deaths demand better from all of us. That's the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Not just what happened, but what it meant, what it changed, what it still demands from us more than a century later. It's a story about work and safety and the value of human life. It's a story about tragedy and reform and the ongoing struggle to protect workers from preventable harm. It's a story worth remembering. They're people worth honouring, and the lessons are worth learning over and over, as long as workers need protection and safety requires vigilance, and ordinary people deserve to come home safe from ordinary jobs. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, and by Thursday morning it had stopped being interesting. It came down in a steady, determined way that made everything feel heavier. The air, the clothes on the line that never dried, the conversations people had while standing in doorways shaking out their umbrellas. The streets of Johnstown had turned to mud in the usual places, the ones that always flooded first when the weather turned. The low corner by the livery stable, the stretch of Washington Street that dipped toward the river, the alley behind the Baptist church where the drainage had never been quite right. People talked about it the way they always did, with that mixture of annoyance and resignation that comes from living in a place where the land doesn't cooperate. Basements were taking on water, roads were washed out on the edges of town, bridges looked swollen and angry, like they were holding their breath. Margaret Hess stood at her kitchen window and watched the Conemaugh River push itself wider, the colour of it all wrong, not the clear brown it usually ran, but a thick, churning grey that looked like it had swallowed half the hillside upstream. The current moved fast enough that you could see logs and branches spinning past end over end, disappearing around the bend toward the stone bridge. She'd lived in Johnstown for 23 years, had seen the river flood a dozen times or more, and every time it happened people said the same things, that the valley was too narrow, that the hills came down too steep, that whoever decided to build a town in a place like this must not have been thinking about what happens when water has nowhere to go. But they stayed anyway. They raised families and built businesses and got used to the idea that once or twice a year the river would remind them who was really in charge. Her husband Frank came in from the shop with his boots caked in mud. Tracking it across the floor, she'd just swept. He didn't apologise, just sat down heavily at the table and started unlacing them with stiff fingers. "River's up another foot," he said. "Maybe more. Charlie says he's moving stock to the second floor." "Charlie's always been nervous," Margaret said, but she kept looking at the water. It was closer than it had been an hour ago. She could see the line where it had been earlier, marked by the way the grass bent and the mud started. Now it was past that, creeping toward the back fence. "It's the damn rain," Frank said. "Won't let up. Ground can't take any more." That was true enough. The earth itself seemed saturated, soft in a way that made walking feel uncertain. You could see it in the way fence posts leaned, in the way the roads had started to buckle and crack. The hills were streaming with runoff, every creek and tributary swollen and loud, feeding into the river like they were all in a hurry to get somewhere. It had rained before, of course. It had rained plenty, but this felt different in a way that was hard to name. Not more violent exactly, but more persistent. Like the weather had settled into a rhythm and didn't plan on changing. By mid-morning the rain was coming down harder again, drumming on the roof with that particular sound that makes you feel closed in. Margaret went about her work mechanically, scrubbing pots and folding laundry, and trying not to think about the water. The children were upstairs, bored and restless from being cooped up inside. She could hear them arguing over something, their voices rising and falling in that way that meant they weren't really fighting, just filling the time. Outside, the street was empty, except for a man leading a horse through the mud, both of them moving slow and careful, like they didn't trust the ground. The thing about the dam was that nobody talked about it much. It was just there, 15 miles upstream, holding back a lake that people went fishing in during the summer. The South Fork Dam, they called it, though. Most folks in Johnstown couldn't have told you much more than that. It had been built decades ago by the canal company, back when they thought canals were the future. Then the railroad came through, and the canal company went bust and the dam got sold to a hunting and fishing club, Rich men from Pittsburgh who wanted a private lake to spend their weekends. They'd made some changes to it over the years, lowered the spillway, added fish screens, patched it up here and there with whatever materials were handy. There'd been talk sometimes about whether the dam was safe. Engineers had looked at it and said things that sounded concerned but not urgent. The club had promised to maintain it properly. And then nothing happened, so people stopped thinking about it. That was how it worked with things like dams. They were large and solid and permanent seeming, and as long as they kept doing their job quietly, they disappeared into the background of ordinary life. You didn't think about the dam any more than you thought about the foundation of your house or the stones in the street. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure was supposed to be boring. The lake it held was enormous, 3 miles long, a mile wide in places, deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom. But it had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and the fact that it stayed put seemed like proof that it always would. Up at the dam, though, things were not holding. The rain that fell on Johnstown fell harder on the hills, and all of it drained into the lake. The water level had been rising for days, climbing inch by inch up the earthen embankment that held it back. The dam was 70 feet high and nearly 1,000 feet across built. Out of clay and rock and earth, packed down into a shape that was supposed to be permanent. But earth is only as strong as what holds it together, and water has a way of finding weakness. The lake pressed against the dam with the weight of billions of gallons, testing every seam and joint, probing for gaps the way water always does. The spillway, which was supposed to relieve pressure when the lake got too full, wasn't big enough. Hadn't been big enough since the club lowered it to keep the road on top from getting washed out. The fish screens they'd installed to keep their stocked bass and trout from escaping also kept debris from passing through, and now branches and leaves were clogging the openings, turning the spillway into a dam of its own. The men at the club knew there was a problem. They could see the water rising, could see it starting to spill over the top of the dam in places where it wasn't supposed to. They'd sent workers out to try to clear the screens, to dig a new spillway, to do anything that might relieve the pressure. But the ground was already saturated, and the rain kept coming, and every hour brought the lake higher. By mid-morning, water was flowing over the centre of the dam in a wide, shallow sheet, cutting into the surface, pulling bits of earth away with it. The dam was starting to fail in the slow, grinding way that earth structures fail. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each loss making the next one easier. Down in Johnstown, people were starting to notice that something felt wrong. The river was rising faster than it should, even with all the rain. It had a strange energy to it, a kind of impatience that didn't match the steady drizzle. John Park, who worked at the lumber yard, stood on the bank and watched logs that had broken free from the upstream piles spinning past in the current. The sound of the water was different, louder, more continuous, like a sustained note that didn't change. He'd heard people talk about floods before, old-timers who remembered the big one in 47, and they always said the same thing, that you could feel it coming before you saw it, that the air itself changed, that animals got nervous and birds went quiet. He didn't know if he believed that, but standing there, watching the river, he felt something turn over in his stomach. Not quite fear, but something close, an awareness that the normal rules might not apply today. He thought about the dam briefly, the way you think about something you've half forgotten. There'd been a telegram earlier, someone had said, a warning sent down from the club, but telegrams came and went, and warnings were cheap. The dam had held for 40 years. Why would today be different? At the Western Union office, the operator had indeed received a message from South Fork. Dam in danger, it said. Water rising rapidly. He'd delivered it to the authorities, who received it with the kind of polite concern that doesn't translate into action. What were they supposed to do? Evacuate the whole town based on a telegram? People had work to do, businesses to run, lives that didn't stop just because someone upriver was nervous about a dam. They'd send someone to check on it maybe, keep an eye on the river, but evacuate? That seemed excessive, and so life continued in its interrupted, rain-soaked way. Shops stayed open. The train station operated on schedule, though the tracks were running through water in places. Schools let out early because of the weather, sending children splashing home through streets that were starting to look more like streams. Families moved valuables upstairs, just in case. Some people, the cautious ones, started thinking about higher ground, not leaving exactly, but positioning themselves to leave if it came to that. The hills around Johnstown were steep and close, and in a real emergency, you could climb pretty quickly. But you'd look foolish doing it if nothing happened. And nothing ever really happened, not in the way people feared. Anna Fenn was trying to decide whether to feel stupid or prudent. She gathered her children, 3 of them, ages 6 to 12, and told them to put on their good shoes and their coats. Her husband thought she was overreacting, said so in the gentle way he had of disagreeing without making it a fight. "It's just rain, Anna, same as always." But it wasn't the same, she wanted to tell him. It felt different. The water was moving differently. The air had a kind of pressure to it, like something building. She couldn't explain it in a way that sounded rational, so she just said, "I want us ready, that's all, in case." "In case of what?" "In case we need to leave." He looked at her like she'd suggested they burn the house down to stay warm, but he didn't argue further. That was the thing about her husband. He thought worry was wasteful, but he didn't stop her from doing it. She packed a bag with bread and cheese and apples, things that would I keep, added a blanket, some candles, matches wrapped in oilcloth. It felt melodramatic, but doing it made her feel better, like she was taking the unease that had been sitting in her chest all morning and turning it into something useful. The sound reached them first before they understood what it was. A low rumble, distant and sustained, like thunder that didn't fade. People stopped what they were doing and listened, trying to place it. Some thought it was a train, though it didn't sound quite right for that. Trains had a rhythm, a clickety-clack, and this was just a continuous roar. Others thought it was blasting, maybe from the quarry up the valley, though nobody could remember hearing about blasting scheduled for today. The sound grew, not louder exactly, but closer, more present, and then someone on the hill above town saw it and started screaming. The wall of water that came down the valley wasn't water anymore, not in any ordinary sense. It was a moving mass 40 feet high, black and churning, carrying everything the lake had held and everything it had picked up on its way down. Trees the size of houses rolled in the surge, their roots spinning upward like skeletal hands. Whole buildings, torn from their foundations upstream, tumbled in the Fiao current, smashing against each other with sounds like cannon fire. Railroad cars, lifted like they weighed nothing, ground and screeched as they collided. Boulders the size of wagons rolled along the bottom, the sound of them scraping audible, even over the roar of the water. This wasn't a flood in the way floods usually happened, with water rising gradually and spreading wide. This was a wall, a moving cliff, the entire lake emptying itself into the narrow valley in a matter of minutes. The dam had finally given way completely, not in a single catastrophic break, but in a cascade of failures that fed on each other. The water flowing over the top had cut deeper and deeper, eroding the centre of the dam until the weight of the lake did the rest. The whole centre section, maybe 300 feet of it, had simply collapsed, and 20 million tons of water had surged through the gap with the force of the entire lake's weight behind it. It had scoured the valley upstream first, stripping away farms and villages, pulling houses apart like they were made of paper. The South Fork Creek Valley had disappeared under the surge, wiped clean in a matter of minutes. And now the flood was heading straight for Johnstown, moving at something like 40 miles an hour, gathering momentum as it funneled into the narrower valley below. In town, there was no single moment of realization, no clean transition from ordinary life to disaster. Awareness came in fragments, spreading person to person, too slow to be useful. Someone saw the water and ran, shouting. Someone else heard the roar and looked up. A few people, the ones already nervous, grabbed their children and started climbing immediately, trusting their fear more than their understanding. But most people hesitated, their minds reaching for familiar explanations, trying to make the sound fit something that made sense. And in those seconds of hesitation, the wall of water hit the edge of town. It struck the Woodvale neighbourhood, first on the western edge. The houses there were small workers' cottages, built close together in neat rows, and the flood went through them like they weren't there. Walls exploded into splinters, roofs lifted and spun away. People who had been standing in doorways trying to see what was happening were swept away before they could process what they were seeing. The flood didn't flow around obstacles. It went through them, converting structures into debris, adding their mass to its own. A locomotive that had been sitting on the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks was picked up and carried like a toy, its wheels still spinning uselessly in the air. The sound was indescribable. Not just loud, but layered, 1,000 different impacts happening at once, and all of it underlaid by the sustained roar of the water itself. There was the deep grinding of boulders, the crack and splinter of breaking wood, the shriek of metal tearing, the lower percussive boom of buildings collapsing, and beneath it, all human sounds, screaming, shouting, the kind of animal noise people make when terror strips away everything else. Margaret Hess had maybe 15 seconds of warning. She was upstairs when the sound began, folding clothes in the bedroom, while Frank was still downstairs trying to nail boards across the lower windows, a useless gesture, though neither of them knew it yet. She heard the roar and went to the window, and what she saw didn't make sense at first. The street wasn't there anymore. In its place was a moving wall of darkness, higher than the houses, coming straight toward her with a speed that her mind couldn't process. She opened her mouth to scream Frank's name, but the sound was lost in the greater noise as the flood hit the house. The impact was total. The front wall of the house simply ceased to exist, blown inward in an explosion of boards and glass and plaster. The floor buckled and tilted, and Margaret fell, grabbing at the doorframe as the whole structure began to move. She could hear Frank below, or thought she could, but the sound was overwhelmed by the terrible grinding roar of the house coming apart. The bedroom wall cracked and peeled away, and suddenly she could see out into the chaos, a spinning, churning mass of water and wreckage, houses and trees and bodies all mixed together in motion. The floor dropped out from under her, and she was falling, hitting water that was full of debris, sharp edges everywhere, impacts that came too fast to track. The cold hit her like a fist, drove the air from her lungs. She surfaced gasping, surrounded by moving pieces of what used to be her life. Furniture, walls, things she couldn't name. Something hit her shoulder hard enough to spin her around, and she grabbed at it reflexively, found herself holding a piece of roof beam. It was floating, barely, and she wrapped her arms around it and held on with everything she had. The current was impossibly strong, pulling her downstream, bouncing her off. Obstacles she couldn't see coming. She caught a glimpse of a woman's face, mouth open in a scream, and then the woman was gone, pulled under or swept away. A child floated past on a door, small hands white-knuckled on the edges, and Margaret reached for them, but the current yanked her in a different direction. The flood carried her toward the centre of town, though town was becoming an abstract concept. The buildings that had defined streets and blocks were being rearranged into chaos. The Methodist church, which had stood on Main Street for 50 years, tilted slowly and then broke apart, its steeple toppling into the current. The Hulbert House Hotel, 4 stories of brick and mortar, shuddered and collapsed floor by floor, each one pancaking down onto the next with sounds like explosions. People clung to whatever they could find, pieces of roof, sections of wall, furniture that happened to float. Some were alone, some in clusters, all of them being carried in the same direction, by water that didn't care about their terror. The valley funneled the flood toward the old stone bridge at the lower end of town, and that's where the character of the disaster changed. The bridge had been built to last, massive limestone arches that had carried trains and wagons for decades. It was too solid to be swept away, too well anchored to fail quickly. When the flood hit it, carrying its accumulated mass of debris, the water went through the arches, but the debris did not. It began to pile up, building a dam of wreckage against the upstream side of the bridge. Houses crashed into the growing pile and stuck there, trees tangled and held. Railroad cars wedged into gaps and created new obstacles. The mass grew with terrible speed, building up and out, creating a temporary, unstable structure, 30 feet high and hundreds of feet across. People were trapped in it, caught in pockets of wreckage, pinned by beams, wedged into spaces too small to escape. Some were injured, bleeding, from cuts and breaks, too hurt to move. Others were simply stuck, able to breathe and see and understand their situation, but unable to do anything about it. The wreckage pile was constantly shifting, settling, compressing as more debris hit it from upstream. People called to each other, voices thin and desperate against the roar of the water. "Help me! I'm here! Oh, please!" The sounds overlapped and echoed, creating a chorus of need that nobody could answer. Margaret found herself driven into the edge of the jam, her beam tangling with other debris until the current couldn't pull her free. She was half in the water, half out, wedged against what looked like part of a barn wall. Her hands were numb with cold, and she couldn't feel her legs properly, but she was alive, which seemed like something worth noting. Around her, the wreckage groaned and shifted. She could hear people nearby, a man's voice calling a name over and over, a child crying, someone else praying in a monotone that suggested they'd been doing it for a while. The water continued to pour through the bridge arches below, but up here in the jam, it was almost still, just a slow swirling around the trapped debris. She tried to move, and found she couldn't, not without dislodging things that might fall on her. The beam she'd been holding was now part of a larger structure, tangled with boards and wire and pieces of things she couldn't identify. Her right arm was pinned somehow, caught between two surfaces she couldn't see. She pulled at it experimentally, and pain shot through her shoulder, bright and clarifying. Not broken, she thought, but trapped. The wreckage creaked around her as new debris hit from upstream, each impact sending vibrations through the entire mass. Time became strange. She couldn't tell if minutes were passing or hours. The rain had stopped at some point, she realised, though she couldn't remember when. The sky above was grey and flat, offering no clues. People kept calling out, but the voices were getting weaker, or maybe her hearing was fading. She thought about Frank, tried to picture where he'd been when the house came apart, but the images wouldn't come together properly. Her mind kept sliding away from the question, finding it easier to focus on smaller things. The cold, the pain in her shoulder, the way water dripped steadily from a board, 6 inches from her face. And then someone nearby said, "Fire." The word didn't make sense at first. Fire was the opposite of what they were experiencing. They were in water, surrounded by water, soaked to the bone with water. But then she smelled it. Smoke, sharp and wrong, cutting through the wet earth smell of the flood. She turned her head, trying to see, and there it was. Flames, visible through gaps in the wreckage, orange and growing. Someone had had a stove going when their house was swept away, or a lantern had broken, or a live wire had sparked against something dry enough to catch. However it started, fire had found fuel in the jam, the compressed wreckage holding pockets of air, materials that had somehow stayed dry or were dry enough to burn once the flames reached them. The fire spread in ways that didn't follow normal logic, jumping through the tangle of debris, finding paths through gaps and spaces, feeding on wood that had been compressed together like kindling. Smoke began to rise from multiple points in the jam, black and thick, visible for miles. People trapped in the wreckage started screaming in a different way now, not calling for help, but making pure sounds of terror. The flames were still distant, but getting closer, and there was nowhere to go. You couldn't swim through the debris, couldn't climb out of it without dislodging things that might kill you, couldn't do anything but watch the orange glow getting nearer and feel the heat starting to build. Margaret pulled at her arm again, harder this time, ignoring the pain. The fire changed the calculation. Being trapped was one thing, being trapped with fire coming was another. She twisted and yanked, feeling something in her shoulder tear, but the arm came free. Her hand was bleeding from where something sharp had cut across the palm, but she could move now, could try to shift her position. She worked her way upward through the wreckage, climbing carefully, testing each handhold before putting weight on it. The mass shifted constantly, groaning and settling, but she kept moving. Around her, others were doing the same, a desperate scramble toward air and open space. The fire reached a pocket of coal oil and exploded with a sound like a thunderclap, sending flames shooting upward. The heat became a physical force, pushing at them even from 20 feet away. People on the edge of the jam threw themselves into the water, choosing drowning over burning. Some made it to clearer water and started swimming for the far bank. Others were pulled back under, by the current or by debris that caught them. Margaret reached what looked like the top of the pile and looked around wildly, trying to find a path out. The flames were spreading faster now, feeding on themselves, and the smoke was getting thick enough to choke on. A hand grabbed her ankle, and she nearly kicked it away before she realised someone was below her, trapped in a way she'd been trapped a moment before. She looked down and saw a girl, maybe 14, pinned under a beam that had her from the waist down. The girl's face was streaked with soot and tears, and her eyes were wide with the kind of fear that's moved beyond panic into something colder and more final. "Please," the girl said, not shouting, just saying it. "Please." Margaret braced herself and tried to lift the beam. It didn't move. She tried again, putting her back into it, feeling muscles strain and tendons creak. But the beam was wedged under other wreckage and wouldn't budge. The fire was close now, close enough that she could feel the heat on her face, close enough to see individual flames licking through gaps in the debris. She looked at the girl and saw understanding pass between them, the acknowledgement that some things can't be fixed, that sometimes all you can do is witness. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and she meant it more than she'd ever meant anything. Then she climbed higher, moving away from the flames, and the girl's voice calling after her, moving because staying would mean dying, and dying wouldn't help anyone. She reached the edge of the jam and jumped, hitting water that was shockingly cold after the heat of the fire. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her downstream and away from the burning mass. She surfaced and started swimming, not toward anything in particular, just away from the bridge and the flames and the screams that were starting to fade behind her. The water carried her maybe half a mile downstream before she managed to grab hold of a tree that was still standing, its roots somehow holding against the current. She wrapped her arms around it and hung there, too exhausted to do anything else. The fire at the bridge was visible from here, a massive pillar of smoke rising into the grey sky. She could see figures moving on the hillsides above town, people who had made it to high ground, watching the valley below. The water level was starting to drop, she realised, not quickly, but noticeably. The flood was passing, draining away, leaving behind wreckage and bodies and a town that was no longer recognisable as a town. She pulled herself up onto the bank, moving slowly, every part of her body reporting damage. Cuts, bruises, something wrong with her ribs, her shoulder on fire. But she was alive. She sat on the muddy slope and looked down at what had been Johnstown and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The streets were gone, buried under layers of debris. Buildings that had stood for decades simply weren't there anymore. The landscape had been scraped and rearranged, turned into something alien and hostile. Pieces of houses were scattered across hillsides, hundreds of feet above where they'd stood. Bodies hung in trees and lay tangled in wreckage. The stone bridge was still standing, but it was almost invisible under the mountain of debris piled against it, and the fire burning in that debris was growing larger as she watched. Other survivors were starting to emerge, climbing out of the wreckage like creatures emerging from burrows. They moved slowly, stunned, their expressions uniform in their incomprehension. People called out names. Sarah, John, have you seen my children? And got no answers, or got the wrong answers, the kind that start with I'm sorry and trail off because there's nothing to say that helps. Margaret listened for Frank's name, for her own name, but heard neither. She tried to stand and found her legs wouldn't quite support her weight, so she sat back down and waited for strength to return. A man appeared beside her, seemingly out of nowhere, and it took her a moment to recognise James Quinn, who had worked at the hardware store 2 blocks from her house. He was shirtless and bleeding from a gash across his forehead, but he was moving with purpose, helping people up the bank. "Can you walk?" he asked her, and she said she thought so, and he offered her an arm and helped her to her feet. They climbed together toward higher ground, joining a growing stream of survivors, all moving in the same direction, toward the hills where the water hadn't reached. At the top of the hill, people were gathering in stunned clusters, wrapping themselves in whatever blankets could be found, taking account of who was there and who wasn't. Families reunited with screaming relief or quiet devastation, depending on who was missing. Margaret stood among them and felt the impossibility of her own survival settle over her like a weight. She was alive when so many others weren't, and there was no reason for it, no logic to who the flood had taken and who it had spared. She'd done nothing to earn this, performed no particular act of bravery or skill. She'd grabbed a beam and held on, and that had been enough. Others had done the same, and died anyway. The fire at the bridge burned through the afternoon and into the evening, turning the sky orange and filling the air with smoke that smelled like burning homes and burning lives. The wreckage pile was so large and so densely packed that there was no way to fight the fire, no way to reach the people still trapped inside it. They could only watch as the flames consumed everything, listening to the sounds of wood cracking and metal groaning, and occasionally, horribly, the sound of people screaming until they didn't anymore. 80 people died in that fire, the newspapers would later report. Though nobody ever knew the exact number, they were trapped in the jam and the fire took them, and there was nothing anyone could do but witness and remember. As darkness fell, the scope of the disaster began to reveal itself in pieces. Runners brought news from upstream. Whole villages gone, wiped completely from the map. Mineral Point, East Conemore, Woodvale, gone. The death toll was enormous, and still climbing as more bodies were found. The exact number wouldn't be known for weeks, but people were already saying thousands. More than 2,000 dead, someone said. Maybe 3,000. The numbers were too large to feel real, too large to connect to the bodies that lay scattered through the valley. Relief efforts started immediately, organised by whoever was left to organise them. The telegraph lines were down, but riders were sent to Pittsburgh and other nearby cities to bring word of what had happened. Temporary shelters were set up in churches and schools on high ground, anywhere that had survived intact. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Most of the doctors' offices had been in the lower part of town and were now part of the debris field. People treated injuries with whatever they could find. Torn cloth for bandages, whiskey for antiseptic, prayers for anaesthetic. The wounded were everywhere, bleeding from cuts and broken bones, and injuries that were harder to define. Internal damages that wouldn't show themselves for hours or days. Margaret spent that first night in a church hall with maybe 60 other survivors, all of them wrapped in donated blankets, most of them silent. A few people wept quietly. Others sat staring at nothing, their faces empty of expression. Children slept fitfully, whimpering in their sleep. Someone had managed to make coffee on a small stove, and the smell of it cut through the other smells. Wet clothes, blood, mud, smoke. Margaret accepted a cup when it was offered and held it with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She hadn't realised how cold she was until that moment. A woman sitting next to her asked if she'd seen a boy, about 10 years old, red hair, wearing a blue jacket. Margaret said she hadn't, and the woman nodded and thanked her and went back to staring at the wall. The question was repeated over and over that night, in different forms. "Have you seen?" Did you notice? Was there a... The answer was almost always no. But people kept asking because not asking meant accepting, and acceptance was still too far away. Frank's body was found 3 days later, or what was left of it. He'd been identified by his wedding ring and a distinctive scar on his left arm. Margaret was told that he'd been found in the debris near where their house had stood, which suggested he'd died in the first moments when the wall hit. She received this information without visible reaction, thanked the man who told her, and went back to the work she'd been doing, sorting through donated clothes to find things that might fit the children who'd lost everything. The grief was too large to feel yet. It sat somewhere behind her breastbone like a stone, present but untouchable, waiting for a moment when she had the space and time to acknowledge it properly. The work of recovery continued through days that blurred together into a continuous effort. Bodies were found and identified when possible, buried when not. The debris field was searched systematically, every pile of wreckage combed through for survivors or remains. Sometimes they found people alive, trapped in pockets where air had collected, and those moments felt like miracles, even though they were so rare. Mostly they found bodies or pieces of bodies, things that had to be handled with care and dignity, even when the people doing the handling were exhausted beyond measure. The valley began to fill with outsiders, relief workers, journalists, curiosity seekers. Supplies arrived by train: food, medicine, lumber, coffins. The American Red Cross, led by Clara Barton herself, set up headquarters in Johnstown and began coordinating the relief effort with impressive efficiency. Temporary housing went up on the hillsides. Kitchens served thousands of meals a day. Medical stations treated the injured and the sick, because dysentery and typhoid were starting to spread through the camps, where survivors were living in close quarters with inadequate sanitation. The cause of the disaster was becoming clearer as engineers examined the dam site. The South Fork Dam had failed completely, catastrophically, in a way that had been predictable to anyone who looked closely. The club had modified it improperly, weakened it, and failed to maintain it. The warning signs had been there for years: leaks, settling, stress cracks, but they'd been ignored or downplayed or patched inadequately. The lake had been a disaster waiting to happen, and the rain had simply been the trigger that set it off. People started looking for someone to blame, someone to hold accountable. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club became the obvious target. Rich men from Pittsburgh who'd owned the dam and failed to maintain it properly. But blame was complicated. The club members hired lawyers who argued that the flood had been an act of God, that nobody could have predicted the rain would be so heavy or last so long, that the dam had been certified by engineers and should have held. They tied the cases up in court for years, and in the end, nobody was ever held criminally responsible. The club paid no damages, admitted no fault. The disaster was declared an unavoidable natural catastrophe, and the families of the dead were left to make what peace they could with that verdict. Margaret rebuilt, because what else was there to do? She found work at a laundry and rented a room in a house on the hill, well above the floodline. She attended services for Frank at a church that hadn't existed before the flood, built with donated lumber by volunteers who'd come from all over the country to help. She listened to the minister talk about God's plan and mysterious ways and tried to feel comforted by the words, but mostly she just felt tired. The grief had settled into something more like a constant ache, present but manageable, a weight she carried everywhere. The town rebuilt too, slowly and with difficulty. New buildings went up, newer and sturdier than what had been there before. The debris was cleared, though it took months. The stone bridge was finally dismantled. It had survived the flood, but was too damaged to be safe. A new bridge went up in its place. Streets were relaid, infrastructure replaced, systems restored. Within a few years, Johnstown looked almost normal again, if you didn't know what to look for. But there were gaps, absences that couldn't be filled. Whole families were gone, their names existing now only in cemetery records and newspaper archives. Businesses that had been passed down through generations ended with the flood. The population was smaller and would stay smaller for years, and everyone who'd survived carried the flood with them in ways both visible and not. They flinched at loud noises, they watched the sky differently. When it rained hard, they listened for sounds that weren't there, watching the river with eyes that had learned not to trust stability. Margaret never married again. She lived in Johnstown for another 40 years, watching the town grow and change, watching new people arrive who didn't know the flood, except as history, as something that had happened before they were born. She became one of the old women who could tell you what it was like if you asked, though most people didn't ask. They wanted to move forward, to think about the future, to put disasters in the past where they belonged. But she remembered. She remembered the sound of the water, the wall of black chaos coming down the valley. She remembered the cold and the terror and the moment when she'd climbed away from the girl who was trapped and dying. She remembered Frank's face the morning of the flood, the way he'd complained about the mud on his boots like it was the worst thing that could happen. She remembered all of it with a clarity that didn't fade, because some experiences are too large to be diminished by time. On rainy days, especially in late spring, when the weather turned heavy, she would stand at her window and watch the river. It ran peacefully most of the time, contained within its banks, useful and ordinary. But she knew what it could become. She knew that the town sat in a valley that funneled water, that the hills stood ready to send their runoff streaming down, that infrastructure could fail and disasters could happen with a speed that made response impossible. The flood had taught her that safety was always conditional, that the ground beneath your feet could turn to chaos without warning, that the things you trusted to hold could give way in moments. The dam was never rebuilt. The lake drained away completely when the dam failed, and the valley it had filled returned to something like its original state, a creek bed, some wetlands, trees growing where water had been. The club disbanded, its members moving on to other recreational pursuits in places where they weren't reminded of their role in one of the worst disasters in American history. The site became a kind of memorial by default, a place where nothing would be built again because everyone knew what had happened there. In 1936, Johnstown flooded again, not as catastrophically as in 1889, but badly enough to kill 25 people and destroy hundreds of homes. Margaret was still alive then, 72 years old and living in the same room she'd rented after the first flood. She evacuated this time when the warnings came, climbed to higher ground without hesitation, and waited there while the river did its work. When the water receded, she returned to find her building intact but damaged, watermarks on the walls showing how high it had risen. She cleaned up and moved back in, because leaving would mean admitting that the valley was unlivable and she'd already survived worse. The lesson of Johnstown, if there was one, was about the distance between what people know and what they believe. Everyone knew the dam was questionable. Engineers had said so. There had been leaks, visible problems, warnings. But knowing and believing are different things. Knowing is abstract, intellectual, the kind of thing you can acknowledge without changing your behaviour. Believing is visceral, urgent, the kind of thing that makes you act. The people of Johnstown knew about the dam, the way people know about any number of risks they live with, theoretically, without urgency. They believed the dam would hold because it had always held, because the alternative was too disruptive to contemplate, because changing your life based on theoretical risk is hard and feels excessive until the moment the theory becomes reality. And then, in the space of a few minutes, theory became the most real thing in the world. The dam that had been holding became the dam that was failing, became the dam that was gone. And in the process, more than 2,000 people died. Not because they were careless or stupid or unprepared in any meaningful sense, but because the thing they'd been told was safe turned out not to be, and the warning came too late to matter. Margaret died in 1943, in her sleep, in the same room where she'd lived for 54 years. She was buried next to Frank in the Grand View Cemetery, which sits on a hill above the valley and has never been touched by floodwater. Her grave marker is simple, just her name and dates, nothing about the flood or what she'd survived. Most of the graves around her are the same, people who lived through the disaster and carried it quietly for the rest of their lives, marked in death only by the years they'd existed, not by the events they'd endured. The valley itself carries the memory differently. The river still runs through Johnstown, still floods occasionally, despite better infrastructure and more careful management. The hills still funnel water down into the narrow space. The town still exists in the same vulnerable geography, the same fundamental arrangement of land and water that made the 1889 disaster possible. The difference is in what people know and what they're willing to believe. The flood proved that disasters can happen, that warnings should be heeded, that infrastructure requires constant vigilance and maintenance. And for a while, people believed that. They built better, planned more carefully, took the threats seriously. But memory fades. The people who lived through the flood died, and their children died, and eventually the disaster became history rather than experience. New generations moved to Johnstown without the visceral understanding of what the valley could do. They knew about the flood the way you know about any historical event, factually, distantly, without the urgency that comes from lived experience. And so the cycle continues, the gap between knowing and believing reasserting itself, the lessons of disaster slowly fading until the next disaster arrives to teach them again. The rain that fell in May of 1889 was not remarkable in itself. Heavy rain falls all the time, in many places, without causing catastrophic floods. What made the Johnstown flood extraordinary was the combination of geography and infrastructure and human decisions that turned ordinary weather into disaster. The valley was naturally vulnerable, funneling water into a narrow space. The dam was poorly maintained, improperly modified, inadequate for the weight it was asked to hold. The warnings were ignored or dismissed as excessive, and when the dam failed, it failed completely, sending the entire contents of a 3-mile-long lake down a narrow valley toward a town that had maybe 15 minutes of warning. The disaster was both inevitable and preventable, which is true of most disasters. Inevitable in the sense that the conditions made it likely. Heavy rain in a vulnerable valley with a questionable dam. Preventable in the sense that better maintenance, better planning, better response to warnings could have changed the outcome. The gap between inevitable and preventable is where people live their lives, making decisions based on incomplete information and competing priorities, balancing risk against convenience, trusting that infrastructure will hold because it has held before. Johnstown trusted, and the trust was betrayed, and 2,000 people died. The survivors rebuilt and continued, because that's what survivors do. They carried the memory forward for as long as they could, trying to pass on the lessons they'd learned. But some lessons can't be taught, only experienced. You can tell someone about a disaster, describe it in detail, show them photographs and survivor accounts and engineering reports, but until they've felt the ground give way beneath them, until they've heard the sound of their world coming apart, until they've made the choice to climb away from someone who's dying because staying would mean dying too, until they've lived it, they don't really believe it could happen to them. That's the real lesson of Johnstown. Not that disasters happen, but that people will always struggle to believe they could happen here, now, to us. We know about risks in the abstract. We read about disasters and nod at the terrible lessons they teach. We might even make modest changes to our behaviour, update our infrastructure, improve our warning systems. But true belief, the kind that changes how we live fundamentally, requires either personal experience or an imaginative capacity that's rare and hard to sustain. The valley still sits between its hills, the river still runs through it, and people still build their lives in the floodplain. They know about the 1889 flood. It's taught in schools, marked by monuments, documented in museums. But knowing isn't the same as believing, and believing isn't the same as acting. And so the gap remains, the distance between what we know could happen and what we truly think will happen. And in that gap we make our homes, and raise our children, and trust that this time will be different, that the dam will hold, that the warnings are excessive, that disaster is something that happens to other people in other places. Until the morning when the rain won't stop, and the water starts to rise, and the distant rumble that could be thunder turns out to be something else entirely. And then, for a brief and terrible time, the gap closes, and knowing becomes believing, becomes experiencing. And the lessons are learned again, the only way they can really be learned, through loss and survival, and the question that has no good answer: why did I live when so many others didn't? Margaret never answered that question satisfactorily. She survived because she grabbed a beam, because the current carried her into the jam instead of under it, because she could climb and jump and swim well enough to stay alive. But thousands of others did the same things and died anyway. There was no logic to it, no moral pattern, no divine plan she could detect. She lived, and they died, and the randomness of it was almost worse than the disaster itself. She could have made peace with a flood that killed everyone, or one that killed only the unlucky or unprepared. But a flood that killed indiscriminately, that took children and spared murderers, that wiped out whole families while leaving their neighbours untouched. That kind of disaster offered no comfort, no meaning, only the cold fact of chance. She tried not to think about the girl she'd left behind, but the girl appeared in her dreams for years. Sometimes Margaret could lift the beam and save her. Sometimes they both escaped the fire together. But most nights, the dream was accurate. She climbed away while the girl called after her, and the last thing she saw before waking was the orange glow of flames through the wreckage. The dream never offered absolution or forgiveness, just the memory played back with perfect clarity, and Margaret would wake with her heart racing and her hands clutching at blankets that were dry and safe, so unlike the cold water and burning debris of that day. The town's memory of the flood became codified in predictable ways. Memorial services were held every year on May 31st, the anniversary of the disaster. Monuments were erected to the dead, listing names when they were known, acknowledging the unknown when they weren't. Survivor accounts were collected and published, turned into the official narrative of the flood, and gradually, through repetition and documentation, the disaster became a story. Still terrible, still tragic, but contained within narrative structures that made it comprehensible. The chaos was smoothed into chronology. The randomness was shaped into cause and effect. The incomprehensible was made, if not understandable, at least describable. But Margaret knew that the story and the experience were different things. The story said the dam failed at 3:10 p.m. The experience was the sound arriving before understanding, the wall of water visible for seconds before impact, the complete dissolution of everything solid into chaos. The story said 2,000 people died. The experience was specific faces, specific screams, the girl under the beam and the woman who'd asked about her son, and Frank's body, identified by a ring and a scar. The story could be told and retold, learned and remembered. The experience could only be survived and carried, a weight that never got lighter, no matter how many years passed. In the end, she stopped trying to explain it to people who hadn't been there. How could you explain the moment when the familiar world became alien, when your house stopped being a house and became just debris in motion? How could you describe the quality of terror that came from being utterly helpless, carried by forces too large to comprehend, surviving only because the chaos happened to carry you through instead of under? The words existed, but they couldn't carry the weight of the experience. They flattened it into description, turned immediacy into past tense, made the unendurable sound merely difficult. So she kept it to herself, mostly, this knowledge of what the world could become. She moved through her days with the awareness always present, like a low hum beneath normal consciousness. When she walked down streets, she noted escape routes. When she entered buildings, she calculated where the water would come from, if it came. When it rained, she listened with a part of her attention always tuned to the sound of distant rumbling, even though she knew the dam was gone and couldn't fail again. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and her body had learned that safety is temporary and disaster can arrive with the speed of falling water. The children she'd helped in the days after the flood grew up and had children of their own, and those children grew up and had children, and eventually the flood moved from living memory into history. The last survivor died in the 1960s, taking with them the last first-hand knowledge of what that day had felt like. After that, the flood belonged entirely to books and photographs and official accounts, preserved but no longer lived, remembered but not experienced. Johnstown continued, because places continue even after disasters. The valley got new buildings and new people and new purposes. The river was dammed and diverted and managed with engineering that would have prevented the 1889 disaster if it had existed then. Flood walls went up, early warning systems were installed, regulations were passed requiring inspection and maintenance of dams. The lessons of the disaster were, at least partially, learned and applied, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. The town still sat in a narrow valley between steep hills. The river still carried water that had to go somewhere. The weather still brought rain that the ground couldn't always absorb. You could manage those factors, mitigate them, plan for them, but you couldn't eliminate them. Johnstown would always be a place where water could collect and threaten, and under the right conditions, overwhelm. The geography ensured it, and that was the final stubborn truth the flood had taught. That some vulnerabilities are inherent, built into the landscape itself, and no amount of infrastructure or planning can eliminate them entirely. You can reduce risk but not remove it. You can prepare but not prevent. You can build and maintain and warn and plan, and still the day might come when the rain falls too hard for too long, and the systems fail, and the water comes anyway. Margaret understood this in a way that went beyond words or logic. She'd felt it in her body when the ground stopped being solid, when home stopped being safe, when the future collapsed into an eternal present of survival and terror. She knew that the world could break, that it had broken before and would break again, that the time between disasters was just an interval of relative calm, not a permanent state. And she knew that most people couldn't live with that knowledge. Not really, not in any sustained way. They needed to believe in safety, in continuity, in tomorrow being mostly like today. Otherwise they'd never sleep, never relax, never build or love or plan for futures that might not come. So she let them believe and kept her own knowledge private, and went about her life in the way that life goes on after disaster. She worked and ate and slept and aged, and the flood became part of her past instead of her present, though it never quite became separate from her. It was there in the way she listened to rain, in the way she watched rivers, in the dreams that still came sometimes, less frequently as years passed but never stopping, entirely. When she was very old, after both the wars, after enough time had passed that the 1889 flood was history, even to people who'd been alive when it happened, someone asked her what she remembered most clearly about that day. She thought for a long moment, sorting through memories that had been worn smooth by decades of recall, and finally said, the sound. Not the water itself, but what came before. That rumble that could have been anything, that your mind kept trying to fit into something familiar. Because there were maybe 30 seconds when you could have done something different, made a different choice, if you'd understood what the sound meant. But you couldn't understand, not really, until it was too late. That's what I remember most, the sound of disaster arriving and not knowing what it was. That was as close as she could come to explaining it. The moment when catastrophe was still approaching, still possible to imagine escaping, if only you could recognize it for what it was quickly enough. But recognition required believing that such things could happen, and belief required either experience or an imagination that most people didn't have. So the sound came, and people listened and tried to understand, and failed to understand in time. And then understanding came with the wall of water, and it was too late for understanding to matter. The questioner thanked her and wrote down her answer, and it became part of the historical record, one more fragment of testimony, preserved for people who wanted to know what the flood had been like. Margaret didn't know if it would mean anything to them, if words on a page could convey the weight of that moment. Probably not. Probably they'd read it and imagine they understood, and then go about their lives confident that such things couldn't happen to them. Not here, not now. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe the dams holding back their particular reservoirs would be maintained properly. Maybe the warnings would be heeded. Maybe the rain would never fall quite hard enough or long enough to turn a landscape into disaster. Or maybe not. Maybe somewhere, sometime, the conditions would align again. Vulnerable geography, questionable infrastructure, heavy rain, ignored warnings. And maybe there'd be another sound, another moment of failing recognition, another wall of water coming down a narrow valley, toward people who knew about risk in theory, but didn't believe it applied to them. And maybe those people would have 30 seconds to understand and act, and maybe they'd fail to understand in time, and maybe they'd learn the lesson the only way it can really be learned. By surviving it or dying in it, by experiencing the moment when knowing becomes believing becomes too late. That was the knowledge Margaret carried to her grave, that disasters are always possible and rarely believed, that the gap between possible and probable is where people live their lives, that the lessons of catastrophe fade as quickly as memory allows because living with true awareness of vulnerability is unbearable. She'd survived by chance and carried the burden of that survival, and tried in her limited way to pass on some warning to the future. But she knew in the end that warnings are cheap and easily dismissed, that people will always trust what has held before. That belief comes from experience, and experience comes at a price too high for anyone to willingly pay. The rain fell in May of 1889, and the dam failed, and the flood came down the valley, and 2,000 people died, and the survivors rebuilt, and life continued, and eventually the disaster became history. That was how it worked. How it always worked. Catastrophe arrived, extracted its toll, receded, and was gradually forgotten or transformed into something less immediate, less visceral, less real. The valley remained, the river ran, and new people came who hadn't learned the old lessons and would have to learn their own when the time came. And Margaret, who had learned and survived and carried the knowledge forward as far as she could, died quietly in a room above the floodplain, having outlived most of her generation and many of the next. She was buried on the hill where the water had never reached, next to Frank, who had died in the first moments, and her life became a span of dates on a stone, a name in census records, a footnote in histories of the flood. The experience she'd carried, the sound, the cold, the terror, the girl in the wreckage, died with her, leaving only the story, which was not the same thing, but was all that remained. The valley continued its existence, caught between the hills, vulnerable to the rain, home to people who knew about the 1889 flood, the way you know about any historical event, factually, distantly, without urgency. They lived their lives in the shadow of a disaster that had already happened, confident that lightning wouldn't strike the same place twice, that lessons had been learned, that it couldn't happen again. And they were mostly right until the days when they weren't, when the rain came too hard, and the systems failed and the water rose, and they learned, briefly and terribly, what Margaret had known for 54 years, that the ground beneath your feet is always provisional, that safety is always temporary, that the world can break faster than you can understand its breaking, and that some lessons can't be taught, only survived. Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The coal fires had been burning since October, as they always did. And by the first week of December, the city had settled into its winter habit. Smoke rising from a million chimneys, merging with the river's exhalation, pooling in the streets like something that had learned the shape of London by heart. People moved through the morning fog with their usual practiced patience, collars turned up against the damp, hands deep in pockets, breath turning to white vapour that mixed with everything else, hanging in the air. The Thames sat low and sluggish between its banks, the bridges rendered in soft charcoal strokes against a sky the colour of old dishwater, and the street lamps wore small halos that didn't so much illuminate the pavement as confirm that light still existed somewhere beyond the general dimness. Nothing about that first morning felt particularly urgent. The fog was thick, yes, but London knew fog the way other cities knew sunshine or wind. As a fundamental condition of winter, existence, something to endure with the same stolid fortitude applied to rationing and queues and the general grinding work of rebuilding what the war had broken. The milkman still made his rounds, bottles clinking in their carrier, his route memorised well enough that he could have walked it blind. The postman still delivered letters, though he moved more slowly than usual, one hand trailing along garden gates to keep himself oriented. In flats and houses across the city, people woke to the smell of coal smoke, mixed with the particular dampness that seeped through window frames, and they pulled on dressing gowns and went to light their own fires, adding their contribution to the general atmosphere without thinking much about it. This was simply what winter meant in London, a season defined by coal and fog, and the patient endurance of both. Margaret Hartley woke that Thursday morning to the sound of her husband's cough, a wet rattling thing that seemed to start somewhere deep in his chest and work its way up like water through old pipes. She lay still for a moment, listening to him try to suppress it, then heard him give up and let it run its course. Through the bedroom curtains, the light looked wrong. Not dark exactly, but thick, as if the morning had been diluted with something grey and substantial. She rose and pulled the curtain back and saw that the street below had disappeared. Not vanished in the dramatic sense, but simply ceased to be visible beyond about 10 feet from the window. The lamp-post directly across from their building stood in its pool of yellowish light like an island, and beyond that was only a kind of shifting blankness that might have been fog or smoke, or some mixture of both. Worse than usual, her husband said from the bed, his voice rough. Kettle's probably cold, Margaret said, which wasn't an answer, but served as one. She tied her dressing gown and went downstairs to the kitchen, where the linoleum was cold enough to feel through her slippers. The flat retained heat about as well as a sieve retained water, and the coal fire in the sitting room had gone out overnight, leaving the whole place with that particular chill that comes from sleeping in a stone box in December. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the back garden, which had also disappeared. The fence at the bottom should have been visible. It was only 30 feet away, but all she could see was grey thickness pressing against the glass, as if something were trying to look in. By the time her husband came down, dressed for work in his postal uniform, the kettle was boiling, and she'd made toast on the gas ring, scraping margarine across it in a thin film that was mostly suggestion. They ate in the kitchen because the sitting room was too cold, and neither of them mentioned the fog, except in passing. The way you might mention rain, an inconvenience certainly, but hardly worth dwelling on. He'd be slower on his route today, might not finish until well after dark, but that was the job. The post didn't stop for weather. He drank his tea standing up, pulled on his coat and scarf, and kissed her on the cheek before heading out into the grey morning, his footsteps on the stairs growing muffled and then silent as the front door closed behind him. Margaret washed the breakfast things and got dressed herself. She cleaned houses 3 days a week in Kensington, and Thursday was one of her days. But when she stepped outside the building and felt the air settle around her like something with weight, she paused on the steps. The smell hit her immediately, a bitter coal bite that seemed to coat the inside of her nose and throat, and when she took a breath, it felt thicker than air should feel, as if she were inhaling something that hadn't quite made up its mind, whether to be gas or liquid. She pulled her scarf up over her mouth and nose and started walking toward the bus stop, keeping close to the buildings, one hand brushing along the rough brick to maintain her sense of direction. The bus stop was supposed to be 3 streets over, a walk she could do without thinking under normal circumstances. But this morning it took her nearly 20 minutes because she had to stop twice to make sure she hadn't turned the wrong way, and once she nearly walked into the back of a milk truck that had stopped in the middle of the street, the driver leaning out his window, trying to see where he was. When she finally reached the stop, there were already a dozen people waiting, all of them standing closer together than Londoners usually did, as if proximity might offer some kind of collective navigation. No one spoke much. They stood and breathed and coughed and waited, watching the place where the bus should appear. And after 40 minutes of this, a figure emerged from the fog. Not the bus, but another person, a woman in a green coat who asked if the 49 had come yet, was told it hadn't and might not, the way things were going. Margaret waited another half hour before giving up and walking back home, the journey taking even longer because the fog seemed to have thickened in the interim. And when she finally let herself back into the flat, she sat down at the kitchen table and realised her chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped a band around her ribs and was slowly pulling it tighter. She made herself another cup of tea and told herself it was just the walk, just the cold, just the natural reaction to breathing all that foulness, and it would pass once she'd rested a bit. Through the window, the grey pressed close, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the muffled sound of traffic, though whether it was moving or stationary she couldn't tell. Across London, similar scenes were playing out in variations. In Bethnal Green, a factory floor supervisor named Thomas Brennan stood at his office window watching the smokestacks disappear into the general murk and wondering if he should send the workers home early, then deciding against it, because production quotas didn't care about weather, and the management would want to know why he'd made that call without authorization. On the floor below, the machines kept running, their noise trapped under the low ceiling, and the workers kept feeding them, though several had already started coughing hard enough that they had to step away from their stations to catch their breath. The windows were closed against the cold, which meant the air inside had nowhere to go, and by mid-morning the smell of coal smoke had seeped in through every crack and gap until the whole factory felt like the inside of a chimney. In Hampstead, Dr. Elizabeth Rosen made her morning rounds at the hospital where she worked, moving from bed to bed in the respiratory ward, and noticed that more patients than usual were struggling. Not dramatically, this wasn't a sudden collapse or crisis, but there was a general labouring, quality to the breathing, a sense that the body's most automatic function had become work that required attention. One elderly woman, admitted 3 days earlier with chronic bronchitis, kept asking if someone had left a window open because she felt like she couldn't get enough air, and Dr. Rosen checked and found all the windows closed tight against the fog, which had somehow managed to creep into the building anyway, giving the corridors a hazy quality that made the lights seem dimmer than they should be. By noon, the hospital's casualty department had begun receiving its first arrivals related to the fog, people who had collapsed on the street, people who had been walking and suddenly found they couldn't breathe properly, people who had simply panicked at the thickness of the air and the way it seemed to be suffocating the city. Dr. Rosen, called down to assist because the casualty staff were overwhelmed, found herself listening to lungs that sounded like wet paper being crumpled, prescribing oxygen that the hospital didn't have enough of, and trying to reassure patients that this was temporary. The fog would lift soon, they just needed to rest and let their bodies adjust. But even as she said these things, she didn't entirely believe them, because this fog didn't feel like something that would lift on its own schedule. It felt like something that had settled in with intention. The afternoon brought no improvement. If anything, visibility worsened, contracting from 10 feet to 5, and then in some places to the point where you could barely see your own hand extended in front of your face. The street lamps came on early, their light creating small spheres of yellowish visibility that only emphasized how complete the darkness was beyond them. Drivers who had tried to navigate by instinct found themselves hopelessly lost, pulling over and simply waiting, hoping the fog would thin enough to reveal some landmark. Others abandoned their vehicles altogether and walked, feeling their way along walls and railings like blind men learning a new route. The buses stopped running entirely by 3 o'clock, their conductors declaring the conditions too dangerous to continue. The underground kept operating, and the stations became crowded with people who had given up on surface transport, descending into the tunnels where at least the air was clear, even if it smelled of electricity and old stone. But even the underground wasn't entirely reliable. Signals failed, drivers missed stops because they couldn't see the platform, signs in the murk that had seeped down from above. And passengers who emerged at their destinations found themselves in a world that bore no resemblance to the London they knew, every familiar landmark erased by the pressing grey. Margaret's husband didn't come home at his usual time. 6 o'clock passed, then 7, and she stood at the window watching for him. Though watching was perhaps the wrong word, since there was nothing to see except the lamppost across the street and the general suggestion of buildings beyond. She told herself he was simply delayed, that the fog had slowed everything down, and he was taking extra time to finish his route. But as 8 o'clock approached and then passed, a different kind of worry began to settle in. Not the dramatic fear of accident or disaster, but the quieter concern that he might be lost, might be wandering in circles somewhere between the sorting office and home, might have stepped off a curb wrong, or stumbled on steps made invisible by the murk. When he finally appeared just before 9, materializing out of the fog, like a ghost finding its way back to the living world, she felt her chest loosen with relief. He looked exhausted, his face grey with coal dust, his eyes red and watering, and when he spoke his voice was barely more than a rasp. "Took me an hour to walk from the high street," he said, unwinding his scarf with fingers that trembled slightly, from cold or fatigue or both. "Had to stop every few minutes to make sure I was still headed the right way. Lost count of how many times I thought I'd turned onto our road, but ended up somewhere else entirely." She made him sit by the fire, which she'd managed to get going again, and brought him tea with extra sugar, which he drank in small sips between fits of coughing that sounded worse than they had that morning. His chest rattled with each breath, and she noticed how shallow the breathing was, as if he couldn't quite fill his lungs all the way. When she suggested he stay home tomorrow, he shook his head. "Can't," he said. "Already used my sick days this year, and anyway, it's just fog. It'll clear." But it didn't clear. Friday morning arrived with the same thick grey presence pressing against every window, the same bitter smell seeping through every crack, the same sense that the city had been sealed inside a jar and left to steep in its own exhalation. Margaret woke to find her husband's side of the bed empty and followed the sound of coughing to the bathroom, where he stood bent over the sink, trying to catch his breath between spasms. His face in the mirror looked pale and drawn, and when he finally straightened up, he had to grip the sink edge to steady himself. "I'm fine," he said, before she could ask. "Just need to get some air." "There's no air," she said. "That's rather the point." But he went to work anyway, moving slowly down the stairs, and she watched from the window until he disappeared into the grey, which happened almost immediately, as if the fog had swallowed him whole. She spent the morning cleaning the flat, wiping coal dust off surfaces where it had settled overnight like black snow, and trying not to think about the tightness in her own chest, which had returned and seemed to be getting worse rather than better. Every breath felt like work, and she found herself having to pause in the middle of simple tasks, washing dishes, making the bed, to catch her breath and wait for the strange pressure around her ribs to ease. By midday, the fog had penetrated the flat completely, despite her efforts to seal the windows with rags and towels. It hung in the rooms like a visible presence, giving the furniture a soft-edged quality, making the walls seem farther away than they should be. She could taste it constantly now, a chemical bitterness that coated her tongue and the back of her throat, and no amount of tea or water seemed to wash it away. When she coughed, which was frequently, it felt like something sharp was scraping the inside of her chest, and she started keeping a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, though it didn't help much. The wireless reported that visibility in some parts of London had dropped to less than a yard. Football matches were cancelled. Theatres were closing. The Smithfield show had been abandoned. The prize cattle standing in their pens, breathing air that wasn't fit for animals or humans, their eyes streaming, their sides heaving. The BBC announcer's voice had the carefully modulated tone that suggested things were under control, even when they weren't, and he encouraged people to stay indoors if possible, to keep windows and doors closed, to avoid unnecessary travel. Then he moved on to other news, as if this were simply another item on the day's agenda, notable, but not alarming. In the hospitals, the situation was becoming distinctly alarming. Dr. Rosen had been on duty since Thursday morning with only brief breaks for sleep, and the respiratory ward was now full beyond capacity, with beds pushed into hallways and patients doubled up in rooms designed for single occupancy. The casualty department had become a continuous stream of people in respiratory distress, elderly mostly, but also young children, people with existing lung conditions, and increasingly people who had been perfectly healthy until they'd spent a few hours outside in the fog. The pattern was consistent: burning throat, chest, tightness, difficulty breathing, and then a kind of exhaustion that came from the body's constant struggle to extract oxygen from air that had become more poison than atmosphere. She moved between patients with a growing sense of helplessness, because there wasn't much she could do beyond provide oxygen, which they were running short of, and offer reassurance that this would pass, though she was less and less certain that was true. One man, a dock worker in his 50s, had been brought in barely conscious, his lips blue, his breathing so shallow and rapid, it barely seemed to move his chest. They'd put him on oxygen immediately, but his saturation levels kept dropping, and she stood by his bed listening to his lungs, a sound like gravel shifting underwater, and knew they were filling with fluid faster than his body could clear it. He died just before dawn on Saturday morning, and the nurse who'd been monitoring him came to find Dr. Rosen with the news, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "He's the third one tonight," the nurse said, "and there's another in bed 7 who doesn't look like he'll make it to noon." Dr. Rosen nodded, wrote the time and cause of death in the notes, and moved on to the next patient, because there wasn't time to do anything else. The death wouldn't be officially connected to the fog. His charts would list cardiac arrest secondary to respiratory failure, which was accurate as far as it went. But she knew, and the nurses knew, and probably the patients knew, that what had killed him was the simple act of breathing London air for the past 3 days. By Saturday afternoon, the fog had taken on an almost supernatural quality in people's minds. It wasn't just thick anymore, it was malevolent, deliberate, a living thing that had decided to occupy London and wouldn't be persuaded to leave. In Piccadilly, someone reported that the fog had turned yellow-brown, like mustard gas, and though this was almost certainly just the effect of coal, smoke mixing with moisture and light, the comparison spread and people began talking about the war, about gas attacks, about whether this might be some kind of enemy action. The government issued statements denying this, assuring the public that the fog was entirely natural, just an unfortunate combination of weather conditions and industrial smoke. But the reassurances did little to calm the growing anxiety that came from not being able to see, not being able to breathe properly, not being able to trust that the air itself wasn't trying to kill you. Margaret's husband didn't go to work on Saturday. He tried, got as far as putting on his coat, but then had to sit down because the room was spinning and his chest felt like it was being compressed in a vice. She made him go back to bed, brought him tea and aspirin, and sat beside him listening to the awful, laboured sound of his breathing. Each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation a wheeze. His face had gone from pale to grey and his lips had a faintly blue tinge that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She suggested calling for a doctor, but he shook his head. Doctors are busy with people who really need them, he said between coughs. It's just a bad cold. I'll be fine in a day or two. But she didn't think it was just a cold, and she didn't think he'd be fine, though she didn't say this because what would be the point? Instead she sat with him and tried to make him comfortable and listened to the fog pressing against the windows like something trying to find a way in. The flat was freezing because she'd let the fire go out. The smoke from the coal seemed to make his breathing worse, and she piled extra blankets on the bed and put hot water bottles at his feet and told herself this was just a matter of waiting it out, that the fog would lift and his breathing would ease and everything would go back to normal. Outside, London continued its strange half-life, the city functioning at a fraction of its usual pace, everything slowed and muffled and made uncertain by the grey blanket that refused to lift. In hospitals across the capital, the wards filled with patients struggling to breathe. In homes and flats and boarding houses, families tended to relatives whose coughs had turned wet and deep, whose faces had taken on that telltale grey pallor, whose bodies had begun the slow work of shutting down from lack of oxygen. The death toll was climbing, though no one knew by how much yet because the deaths were scattered. Individual, private, someone's grandfather, someone's infant daughter, someone's neighbour who had seemed fine yesterday and was gone this morning. They accumulated quietly, without drama, like interest on a debt that no one had agreed to take on. Dr. Rosen worked through Saturday night and into Sunday morning, watching patients deteriorate despite every intervention, filling out death certificates for people who had been walking around just days earlier, and trying not to think about the fact that she herself was breathing the same poisoned air, that her own chest had started to feel tight, that her throat burned and her eyes watered, and she couldn't stop coughing whenever she paused for more than a few minutes. The hospital had become a kind of fortress under siege, its corridors hazy with smoke that had crept in through ventilation systems and around window frames, its staff exhausted and increasingly ill themselves, its resources stretched to the point where they were having to make decisions about who got oxygen and who had to manage without. One of the ward sisters collapsed on Sunday morning, just keeled over in the middle of taking a patient's temperature, and had to be admitted herself with what the examining doctor diagnosed as acute bronchitis brought on by prolonged exposure to the polluted air. 2 other nurses had gone home sick the day before and hadn't returned. The remaining staff carried on with the grim determination of people who know they're fighting a losing battle but refuse to acknowledge it, moving from bed to bed, administering what comfort they could, holding hands and speaking softly and pretending that things weren't as bad as they clearly were. And then on Sunday afternoon, the wind changed. It started as a barely perceptible shift, a slight movement in the air that most people didn't notice at first because they'd grown accustomed to the absolute stillness that had characterised the past few days. But gradually, imperceptibly, the fog began to thin. Not dramatically. This wasn't a curtain being pulled back to reveal sudden clarity, but in small degrees, visibility expanding from 3 feet to 5, from 5 to 10, from 10 to the point where you could see across the street if you squinted. The yellow-brown colour faded to grey, then to something closer to normal winter mist, and by evening it was possible to see the tops of buildings again, to make out the shapes of trees in parks, to recognise landmarks that had been invisible for days. People emerged from their homes cautiously, as if testing whether the air had become breathable again, and found that while it still smelled of coal and tasted bitter, It no longer felt like breathing through cloth. The street lamps, which had been burning continuously for 4 days, cast actual circles of light instead of dim halos. Traffic began moving again, tentatively at first, drivers relearning routes they'd known by heart but had been unable to navigate blind. The buses started running on reduced schedules. The underground stations emptied somewhat as people risked the surface again. London, in short, began to remember how to be itself. But the hospitals didn't empty. If anything, they grew more crowded as the fog lifted, because now people who had been enduring symptoms at home, telling themselves it was just the weather and would pass, realised that their breathing wasn't improving, that their coughs weren't getting better, that the damage done by 4 days of breathing poison air wasn't something that would simply reverse itself the moment the fog cleared. Dr. Rosen saw patient after patient wheeled in with pneumonia, with bronchitis, with lungs so compromised that even clean air wasn't enough to sustain them. The elderly and the very young were hit hardest, but no one was immune. She treated a bus conductor in his 30s, previously healthy, whose lungs had filled with fluid so quickly he was drowning in his own secretions. She treated an infant whose breathing had become so laboured that the muscles between her ribs were pulling inward with each breath, the tiny body working desperately to extract oxygen it couldn't get. She treated a woman in her 70s who told her quite calmly that she'd lived through the Blitz and 2 world wars and never thought she'd be done in by fog. Margaret's husband deteriorated on Sunday evening, his breathing becoming so difficult that she finally overcame his protests and called for an ambulance. It took nearly 2 hours to arrive. The ambulance service was overwhelmed with calls, and when the attendants finally carried him down the stairs on a stretcher, his lips were blue and his consciousness was fading in and out like a badly tuned radio signal. They took him to the nearest hospital, which was already full, and Margaret sat in the waiting room for 3 hours before a nurse came to tell her that her husband had been admitted to a ward and was on oxygen and stable for now, though the doctor would need to see her in the morning to discuss his condition. She went home to the empty flat and sat at the kitchen table, not crying because crying would have required more energy than she had, just sitting and breathing and noticing how each breath still hurt, how her chest still felt bound by invisible bands, how tired her whole body felt from the simple work of staying alive. Outside, the fog had lifted enough that she could see the building across the street, its windows glowing with light, and beyond that the faint suggestion of stars in a sky that had been invisible for days. The worst was over, everyone said so. The fog had cleared, and now it was just a matter of recovering from it, of letting bodies heal and routines resume, and life return to normal. But when Margaret slept that night, she dreamed of drowning in air, of trying to breathe, and finding only thickness. And when she woke on Monday morning, her pillow was damp with sweat, and her chest felt no better than it had the night before. She dressed and walked to the hospital through streets that looked almost normal again, though there was a greasy residue on every surface. Windowsills, railings, the shoulders of buildings, like the fog had left its fingerprints behind. The hospital was chaos, every ward full, corridors lined with beds, staff moving at a half-run between patients. And when she finally found her husband in a ward on the 3rd floor, he looked worse than he had the night before. The oxygen mask covered half his face, and even with it his breathing sounded laboured, each inhalation a visible effort. His eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment she thought he was already gone. But then a nurse touched her arm and told her he was sleeping, that they'd had to sedate him because the panic from not being able to breathe properly had been making things worse. "Will he recover?" Margaret asked, and the nurse gave her the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring, but wasn't. "The doctor will speak with you," she said, and moved on to the next bed. Margaret sat by her husband's bed for most of that day, watching his chest rise and fall with effort, listening to the sound of his breathing mixed with the breathing of a dozen other patients in the ward, all of them struggling, all of them fighting the same invisible enemy that had occupied their lungs and didn't want to leave. Other visitors came and went, their faces wearing the same expression of worried helplessness, and the nurses moved between beds with practiced efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting oxygen, offering small comforts that couldn't really address the fundamental problem, which was that breathing had become difficult and painful and might remain so for a long time, if it ever got better at all. The doctor, when he finally appeared, was young and looked like he hadn't slept in days. He pulled Margaret aside and spoke to her in the corridor, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "Your husband has severe bronchitis complicated by cardiac stress," he said. "His lungs are inflamed and producing excess mucus, which is making it difficult for him to breathe. The oxygen is helping, but his heart is working very hard to compensate, and that's putting strain on his entire system. We're doing everything we can, but the next 24 hours will be critical." "Will he die?" she asked, because there didn't seem to be any point in asking anything else. The doctor paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not responding to treatment as well as we'd like, but he's strong, and if we can keep his oxygen levels stable and prevent any secondary infections, there's reason to be optimistic." It was the kind of answer that wasn't really an answer, and Margaret understood this. She thanked him and went back to her husband's bedside and sat there until the nurses told her visiting hours were over and she'd have to leave. She walked home through streets that had returned to their normal December dimness. The fog reduced to ordinary winter mist, and when she let herself into the flat, it felt impossibly empty, as if the fog had taken more than just visibility and clean air, as if it had carved out some essential part of the city's life and left behind only the hollow shape of things. Across London, similar scenes were playing out in thousands of homes and hospital wards. The fog had lifted, but its effects lingered like a stain that wouldn't wash out. In Bethnal Green, Thomas Brennan's factory reopened on Monday morning with half its usual workforce, the rest either sick at home or in hospital or dead, though the deaths wouldn't be tallied for weeks yet and wouldn't be officially attributed to the fog even then. In Hampstead, Dr. Rosen worked another double shift because 2 more nurses had called in sick, and the ward was even more overwhelmed than it had been during the worst of the fog. Every bed occupied by someone whose lungs had been damaged by 4 days of breathing poison. The newspapers began running stories about the Great Fog, printing photographs of ghostly figures moving through the murk, interviewing people who described the terror of being unable to see, the confusion of being lost in familiar streets, the creeping fear that had come from realizing the air itself had become dangerous. But the stories had a certain distance to them, a narrative quality that suggested the crisis was already past tense, something to be discussed and analysed, and eventually filed away as history. The fog had been extraordinary, yes, but it had lifted, and London was resilient, and life would go on. What the newspapers didn't emphasise, or perhaps didn't fully understand yet, was that the death toll was still rising. Not from the fog itself, the fog was gone, but from the damage it had done, the weakened lungs and strained hearts and compromised immune systems that made people vulnerable to infections and complications that might not have killed them under normal circumstances. The official count put the number of dead at a few hundred, based on the deaths that had occurred during the 4 days of the fog itself, but this number didn't account for the people who died in the following weeks, whose deaths were recorded as pneumonia or heart failure or bronchitis or old age, but whose real killer had been 4 days of breathing air thick with coal smoke and sulfur dioxide and particulates so small they could penetrate deep into lung tissue and stay there, causing damage that would never fully heal. Margaret's husband died on Tuesday evening, his heart giving out after nearly 48 hours of trying to oxygenate blood that his damaged lungs couldn't properly supply. A nurse came to find Margaret in the waiting room, where she'd been sitting for most of the day, and the look on the nurse's face told her everything before any words were spoken. She went to see him one last time, his face peaceful now without the struggle of breathing, the oxygen mask removed, and she sat beside the bed and held his hand, which was already cooling, and tried to remember what his voice had sounded like before the coughing had taken it over, before the fog had filled his lungs with thickness that wouldn't clear. They gave her his belongings in a paper bag: wallet, watch, wedding ring, a handkerchief still stained with the coal dust that had worked its way into everything during those 4 days. She walked, home carrying the bag and feeling like she was moving through a different city now, one that looked the same, but had been fundamentally altered in ways that weren't visible, but were nonetheless permanent. The fog had lifted, but it had left its mark, not just in the deaths and illnesses, but in the knowledge that London's air could kill you, that the coal fires everyone burned for warmth were also filling the atmosphere with poison, that the industrial progress everyone took such pride in had a cost that was measured in damaged lungs and stopped hearts and lives cut short. The official inquiries began within days. Committees formed to investigate what had happened and why and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. Medical officers presented data showing spikes in mortality during the fog period, though the exact numbers were contested because death certificates listed immediate causes rather than underlying ones, and it was difficult to prove definitively that a particular death was caused by fog rather than by the heart disease or chronic bronchitis or pneumonia that appeared on the official record. Environmental scientists talked about temperature inversions and stagnant air masses and the concentration of pollutants that occurred when industrial emissions and domestic coal burning were trapped under a layer of cold air with nowhere to disperse. Politicians made speeches about the need for clean air legislation and controls on industrial pollution, though these were mostly cautious and non-committal, because any real action would require confronting powerful interests and admitting that the way London had been living and working for generations was actively harmful. Dr. Rosen gave testimony to one of the investigating committees, describing the influx of patients she'd seen, the severity of their symptoms, the number of deaths she'd witnessed. She presented her notes and case studies, documented the timeline of admissions and the correlation between pollution levels and respiratory distress, argued forcefully that this wasn't just an unfortunate weather event, but a public health crisis caused by human activity that could and should be prevented from happening again. The committee members listened politely, asked questions about her methodology, thanked her for her time, and then moved on to the next witness. She left the hearing with the distinct impression that her testimony, like most testimony from medical professionals, would be acknowledged but not acted upon, filed away as evidence of a problem that everyone agreed existed, but no one quite knew how to solve without disrupting the economic and social systems that depended on cheap coal and unregulated industrial production. The final death toll would be debated for years. The official count put it at around 4,000 deaths directly attributable to the fog, based on the excess mortality during the first 2 weeks of December compared to normal rates. But other estimates, accounting for the deaths in the following weeks and months from complications and exacerbations of existing conditions, put the number closer to 12,000 or even higher. The truth was somewhere in that range, and the exact number mattered less than the fact that thousands of people had died from breathing air in their own city, in their own homes, during the course of their normal lives. They hadn't been killed by bombs or disease outbreaks or natural disasters. They'd been killed by coal smoke and fog, and the particular meteorological conditions that had turned London's atmosphere into a slow-acting poison for 4 days in December. Margaret went back to work cleaning houses in Kensington after the funeral because she needed the money and because sitting alone in the flat made her think too much about her husband's last days. The sound of his breathing, the look on his face when he tried to tell her he was fine, and they'd both known he wasn't. The houses she cleaned were warm and well appointed, their fires burning in grates that had been properly swept and maintained, their windows sealed against drafts, their rooms arranged with the kind of casual comfort that came from having enough money that you didn't have to think about whether you could afford coal or how much to burn, or whether the air you were breathing might be killing you slowly. She dusted and scrubbed and polished, and sometimes she found herself pausing to catch her breath because her chest still hurt. Her lungs still felt compromised, and she wondered if this was permanent now, if she'd spend the rest of her life with this tightness, and this cough, and this reminder every time she tried to take a deep breath, that 4 days in December had done something to her body that couldn't be undone. The city moved on because that's what cities do. The fog became a story people told, a historical event marked by photographs and testimonies and official reports, something that had happened and was now over. The clean air legislation that eventually passed years later, after more deaths and more inquiries and more pressure from medical professionals and environmental activists, would cite the Great Fog as a turning point. The moment when London finally had to confront the consequences of its industrial practices and domestic heating methods. Smokeless zones would be established, coal burning would be regulated, air quality would be monitored, and gradually, over decades, London's air would become cleaner, and the thick fogs that had been a defining feature of winter in the city would become less frequent and less severe until they disappeared entirely from anything but memory and historical accounts. But for the people who had lived through those 4 days, who had lost family members or friends or their own health to air that had turned toxic, the fog remained more than just a historical event. It was a marker, a dividing line between before and after, between the London that had seemed permanent and stable and the London that had revealed itself to be vulnerable in ways no one had quite understood until it was too late to prevent the damage. Margaret would live another 30 years, her lungs never quite recovering from the assault they'd endured, her breathing always slightly laboured, her energy always slightly diminished, and every winter, when the air turned cold and the coal fires started burning again, she would feel that tightness return, that sense of the atmosphere closing in, and she would remember her husband's last days in the hospital ward, the terrible sound of his breathing, the way his hand had felt in hers when it was no longer warm. The most unsettling thing about the fog, when people talked about it years later, wasn't its severity or its death toll or even its sudden arrival. It was the way it had crept up on everyone, the way something familiar, winter fog, coal smoke, the normal conditions of London life, had transformed imperceptibly into something deadly without anyone quite noticing until it was too late. There had been no warning, no dramatic announcement that the air had become poisonous, no moment when everyone simultaneously realised they were in danger. Instead, it had been a gradual recognition, person by person, family by family, that something was very wrong, that breathing had become difficult, that the city they thought they knew had become hostile in the most fundamental way possible. Dr. Rosen would spend the rest of her career studying the effects of air pollution on respiratory health, publishing papers and giving lectures and advocating for stronger environmental regulations. But she never forgot those 4 days in December when her ward had filled with people drowning in air, when she'd watched patient after patient struggle to breathe despite every intervention, when the simple act of existing in London had become a life-threatening condition for thousands of people. She would tell her students about it, using it as a case study in environmental health and public policy. But even as she presented the data and the statistics and the medical evidence, she would remember the more personal details. The sound of all those laboured breaths, the smell of the fog-tainted air that had crept into the hospital corridors, the exhaustion of working shifts that stretched into days because there was no time to rest when people kept arriving, unable to breathe, the particular helplessness of being a doctor with nothing useful to offer except oxygen and reassurance, and the hope that the body's resilience would be enough to compensate for the damage being done. The fog became a reference point, a benchmark against which other environmental disasters were measured. When air quality was particularly bad, people would say it was almost as bad as 52, though it never quite was, not after the regulations took effect and the smokeless zones were established and coal burning was restricted. The generation that had lived through it carried the memory differently than those who only knew it from history books and documentary footage. For them, it wasn't just a historical event, but a visceral experience, something that had lodged itself in their bodies and their memories in ways that couldn't be fully conveyed through statistics or official reports. Thomas Brennan's factory in Bethnal Green never quite recovered its full workforce after the fog. Some workers had died, others had moved on to other employment while the factory was shut down, and still others had developed respiratory problems that made them unable to continue the kind of physical labour the factory required. Production quotas were adjusted downward, contracts were lost to competitors, and eventually the factory closed entirely, though whether this was because of the fog or just the general economic pressures of the time was impossible to say definitively. Brennan himself developed chronic bronchitis that lasted the rest of his life, a persistent cough and wheeze that doctors attributed to years of working in industrial environments with poor ventilation, but which he always privately believed had been started, or at least significantly worsened by those 4 days of breathing poison in December 1952. The hospitals took years to clear the backlog of patients whose health had been compromised by the fog. Some recovered fully, their lungs healing, their breathing returning to normal, their bodies demonstrating the remarkable resilience of healthy systems given time and clean air. Others never quite regained what they'd lost, living with reduced lung capacity, increased vulnerability to respiratory infections, chronic coughs that flared up every winter when the air turned cold and the coal fires started burning. The very young and very old, whose systems had been most severely affected, showed the longest lasting effects, and mortality rates among survivors remained elevated for years afterward as damaged organs gradually failed under stresses that healthy systems would have weathered without difficulty. The official inquiries produced thick reports with detailed findings and careful recommendations, most of which emphasised the need for better air quality monitoring, restrictions on industrial emissions, and gradual transitions away from coal burning in domestic settings. The reports acknowledged that the fog had been a disaster, that lives had been lost unnecessarily, that changes were needed to prevent similar events in the future, but they were also cautious not to assign too much blame or to suggest that fundamental transformations of London's economic and industrial infrastructure were required. The tone was one of reasonable concern, leading to reasonable proposals for incremental improvements, which was politically safe, but practically limited in its ability to address the root causes of the problem. Still, change did come, slowly and incompletely, but measurably. The Clean Air Act of 1956 established smokeless zones in London and other cities, required homeowners to switch to cleaner fuels or electric heating, imposed restrictions on industrial emissions, and created frameworks for monitoring and regulating air quality. Implementation was gradual. You couldn't simply ban coal overnight when entire neighbourhoods depended on it for heat. But over the course of years, the air in London did become cleaner, the thick fogs did become less frequent, and the kind of atmospheric conditions that had created the disaster of December 1952 became increasingly rare and eventually stopped happening altogether. Margaret lived to see these changes, watching as her neighbourhood's smokeless zone was established, as neighbours complained about the cost of converting their heating systems or buying the cleaner but more expensive fuels, as the winter air gradually became less thick and less bitter and less likely to trigger the coughing, fits that had plagued her since the fog. She never quite trusted it though, never quite believed that the air wouldn't turn toxic again when conditions were right. Every winter brought a faint anxiety, a vigilance about the quality of her breathing, a readiness to retreat indoors and seal windows if the air started to thicken. The fog had taught her that the atmosphere itself could be dangerous, that the familiar could become deadly, that survival sometimes depended on recognizing threats that didn't announce themselves with sirens or warnings, but simply settled in quietly and started killing people before anyone quite realized what was happening. By the time she died in the early 1980s, the Great Fog had become historical. something younger Londoners knew about only from their parents' stories, or from history classes, or from the occasional anniversary article in the newspapers. The city she left behind was in many ways cleaner and safer than the one she'd lived in during those 4 days in December. Its air monitored and regulated, its coal fires replaced by cleaner heating systems, its industrial emissions controlled by laws and enforcement mechanisms that hadn't existed in 1952. But she would have told anyone who asked that the cost of learning those lessons had been too high, that 4,000 or 8,000 or 12,000 lives, whatever the real number was, shouldn't have been required to teach people that burning coal in a sealed valley during stagnant weather conditions would create air too poisonous to breathe safely. The fog itself, the meteorological event that had trapped all that pollution over London for 4 days, had been unusual but not unprecedented. Temperature inversions happened, had always happened, would continue to happen whenever the right combination of high pressure and cold air created conditions that prevented normal atmospheric mixing. What had been unprecedented was the concentration of pollutants that had accumulated under that inversion, the smoke from millions of coal fires, the emissions from factories and power plants, the exhaust from vehicles, all of it trapped in a space too small for it to disperse harmlessly. The fog had simply made visible what was always there, had concentrated it and held it close enough that people couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend that the air they were breathing was harmless just because they couldn't see the poison most of the time. This was perhaps the most uncomfortable truth to emerge from the inquiries and investigations, that the fog hadn't introduced anything new into London's atmosphere, hadn't created pollutants that weren't already present every day. It had simply trapped them, concentrated them, made them thick enough to see and taste and feel, turned the background hum of pollution into a roar that couldn't be ignored. On clear days, on windy days, on normal winter days when the air circulated and dispersed the emissions from all those fires and factories, Londoners were still breathing coal smoke and particulates and sulphur dioxide. They just weren't breathing enough of it all at once to make them acutely ill or to kill them over the course of 4 days. The damage was happening more slowly, accumulating in lungs over years and decades, shortening lives in ways that were harder to measure and easier to attribute to other causes. The doctors who studied the fog's aftermath documented this in their research, showing that respiratory disease rates in London had been elevated for years before the fog and remained elevated for years after, that the fog had simply been an acute crisis sitting on top of a chronic problem, that addressing the immediate disaster without addressing the underlying conditions was like treating a symptom while ignoring the disease. Their papers were published in medical journals, cited in policy discussions, used as evidence in debates about environmental regulation. Some of this research contributed to the eventual passage of clean air legislation. Much of it was simply filed away, acknowledged but not acted upon, because the changes required to truly clean London's air were expensive and politically difficult and would require confronting powerful economic interests that profited from industrial pollution and cheap coal. In this sense, the fog was both a turning point and a continuation. It changed things, legislation was passed, regulations were implemented, air quality did improve over time. But it also revealed patterns that would repeat in other contexts, other cities, other environmental crises, the reluctance to act until the damage became undeniable, the gap between recognizing a problem and implementing solutions, the way economic interests and political calculations could delay or dilute necessary changes, the tendency to treat acute crises as isolated events, rather than symptoms of deeper systemic issues. The people who had lived through the fog, who had lost loved ones, or their own health to 4 days of poisonous air, understood this in ways that policymakers and economists and politicians often didn't. They had learned that the most dangerous threats aren't always the dramatic ones, that disaster can arrive looking like weather, that sometimes the things killing you are the same things keeping you warm. Dr. Rosen retired in the late 1970s, her career having spanned the transition from pre-Clean Air Act London to a city where the kind of fog that had killed thousands was no longer possible. She had seen air quality improve measurably, had watched respiratory disease rates decline as pollution controls took effect, had witnessed the gradual transformation of London's atmosphere from something that could kill you in 4 days to something that might shorten your life by a few years if you were unlucky, but was unlikely to cause acute crisis. This was progress, undeniably, but it had come too late for the thousands who had died in 1952, too late for the countless others whose health had been permanently compromised, too late for all the people who had spent their lives breathing air that was slowly poisoning them without quite realizing it, until the fog made it impossible to ignore. In her final years, when students or journalists asked her about the Great Fog, she would tell them about the medical details, the respiratory distress, the fluid-filled lungs, the cardiac strain. But she would also tell them about the silence, how quiet the hospital had been, despite being full of people, because everyone was too breathless to talk much, too exhausted from the work of breathing to engage in casual conversation. How the normal sounds of a hospital ward, the chatter of visitors, the conversations between nurses, the general hum of human activity had been replaced by a chorus of laboured breathing and coughing that never quite stopped. How even the street noise had been muffled by the fog, creating an eerie stillness that made the city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. She would tell them that the worst part hadn't been the deaths themselves, terrible as those were, but the way they had accumulated so quietly, without drama or spectacle, each one a private tragedy in a hospital bed or a home, each one easily attributed to other causes if you didn't look at the larger pattern. The fog hadn't killed people the way a bomb killed people, with noise and destruction and immediate visible evidence. It had killed them the way coal smoke killed people, slowly, quietly, in ways that were easy to overlook or misattribute unless you were paying very close attention to the data and willing to see what it was telling you. This pattern would repeat itself in other environmental disasters, other public health crises, other situations where the danger was cumulative rather than acute, where the damage was done gradually enough that it could be ignored or denied until it reached a threshold. That forced recognition. The fog had been one of those threshold moments when the cumulative effects of pollution had been compressed into 4 days and made undeniable. But even then, even with thousands dead and tens of thousands sickened, the response had been measured and gradual, the changes implemented slowly, the economic and political resistance to meaningful action substantial enough that it had taken years to pass even modest regulations. What remained, decades later, was a story about the strange way disasters can unfold, about how familiar things can turn deadly without warning, about the gap between recognizing danger and doing something about it. The Great Fog became a parable, a cautionary tale, a reference point for discussions about environmental health and public policy. But it was also a memory held by those who had lived through it, who had breathed that air and survived or hadn't, who carried in their bodies and their minds the knowledge of what it felt like when the city itself turned hostile in the most fundamental way possible, when the simple act of breathing became difficult and dangerous and potentially fatal. Margaret's story, her husband's death, Dr. Rosen's exhausted night shifts, Thomas Brennan's factory closing, the child who died in the war despite oxygen and intervention, the elderly woman who had survived 2 world wars but not 4 days of fog. These individual narratives accumulated into a larger story about collective vulnerability, about the ways entire populations can be endangered by systems they depend on, about the difficulty of recognizing and responding to threats that don't announce themselves dramatically but simply settle in and start doing damage before anyone quite realizes what's happening. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't that disasters are unpredictable or that danger comes from nowhere. The fog hadn't been a bolt from the blue. Scientists had understood for years that pollution could accumulate to dangerous levels under certain atmospheric conditions. Doctors had been tracking respiratory disease rates. Environmental advocates had been warning about the health effects of coal smoke. The knowledge had been there. The warnings had been given. The danger had been understood by those paying attention. What the fog demonstrated was the gap between knowing and acting, between understanding a problem and implementing solutions, between individual awareness and collective response. London had known its air was polluted. People had known that coal smoke was harmful, that industrial emissions contributed to respiratory disease, that the thick fogs that characterized winter in the city were more than just weather. They were atmospheric events shaped by human activity, concentrations of pollutants that made breathing difficult and dangerous. But knowing this hadn't been enough to change behaviour or policy, because change was expensive and politically difficult and would have required confronting entrenched economic interests and altering established patterns of life. So the knowledge had existed alongside the pollution, awareness had coexisted with inaction, and the city had continued burning coal and producing smoke, and hoping that nothing would happen to make the cumulative effects of all that pollution impossible to ignore. The fog had been what happened when that hope ran out, when the atmospheric conditions and the pollution levels aligned in exactly the wrong way, when the invisible became visible and the chronic became acute, and the background noise of slowly accumulating damage became an immediate crisis that killed thousands in 4 days. It had forced recognition, had made the danger undeniable, had created enough political pressure that change became possible even if it remained difficult and slow. But it had also revealed the cost of waiting for crisis before acting, of requiring dramatic proof before implementing solutions to known problems, of treating environmental health as something that could be addressed later rather than now. The people who had died in the fog, the elderly dock worker drowning in his own lungs, the infant struggling to breathe despite oxygen, Margaret's husband with his blue lips and failing heart, the thousands of others whose names appeared on death certificates, listing immediate causes that didn't quite capture the real story. They had paid that cost. Their deaths had been the price of learning a lesson that could have been learned earlier, less expensively, if the political will and economic resources had been mobilized before, rather than after the crisis. This was the unsettling part, the part that made the fog more than just a historical event, that made it a cautionary tale about the costs of delayed action and the dangers of waiting for disaster before taking known problems seriously. When the Clean Air Act finally passed in 1956, it represented a victory for public health and environmental protection, a recognition that air quality needed to be regulated and protected, that people had a right to breathe air that wouldn't kill them. But it also represented an admission that this protection had been possible all along, that the technology and knowledge and understanding required to prevent the fog had existed before 1952, that the deaths had been preventable if different choices had been made earlier. The legislation came too late for those who had died, too late for those whose health had been permanently damaged, too late for all the people who had spent years breathing polluted air before the fog made the danger impossible to ignore. This was perhaps the fog's most enduring legacy, not just the immediate changes it prompted, but the pattern it revealed, the demonstration of how disasters unfold when known dangers are left unaddressed, when warning signs are ignored, when action is delayed until crisis forces it. The story of the Great Fog became a template for understanding other environmental and public health crises, other situations where knowledge existed but wasn't acted upon, where dangers were understood but not prevented, where the gap between knowing and doing allowed preventable harm to occur. And so the fog persisted in memory and meaning long after it had lifted from London streets, long after the air had been cleaned and the regulations implemented, and the city transformed into a place where such concentrated pollution was no longer possible. It persisted in the scarred lungs of survivors, in the empty chairs at family tables, in the cautionary tales told to new generations, in the policy discussions about environmental regulation and public health. It persisted as a reminder that the most dangerous disasters aren't always the ones that arrive with warning and spectacle, that sometimes danger comes looking like weather, like winter, like the familiar patterns of ordinary life, and only reveals itself as deadly when it's already inside the body, already doing damage, already too late to avoid entirely, though never too late to begin learning from. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.